Okay, welcome back from lunch, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with our afternoon session. And the plan is to begin with a discussion regarding longfin squid, the 2024 through 2026 specifications. Jason is going to continue with his work today and provide us the information we need to decide on how we want to move forward with specs. So whenever you're ready, Jason.
Thank you. Overview, kind of similar structure as mackerel in terms of some background and then decision points, but less problematic than mackerel, hopefully. Brief background on management. I think the first thing to kind of remember with longfin squid is that the annual quota is divided up into 3 trimesters. It's been that way since 2007. The trimesters were, as I've kind of went back at some point and researched it, were originally set up to preserve quota more from an allocation perspective. So there's quota throughout the year for the different inshore and offshore components of the fishery. But because of the sub-annual lifespan of longfin squid, the trimesters also kind of serve to make sure that no cohort or micro cohort, the population structure of longfin squid gets hit with like the whole quota at one time. So the original intent was more allocation based, but it also serves a biological purpose. There's some rollover allowed from trimester 1 to 2 if trimester 1 doesn't catch that much. But trimester 2 can only be increased by 1.5 times its original amount. And similar kind of rationale there that the council sets previously, so that trimester 2 doesn't have too much fishing going on in that. And then any overages and underages from trimesters 1 and 2 roll over into trimester 3. Basically in trimester 3, you just operate on the full quota. There's also a butterfish discard cap, which has not restricted the fishery in recent years. I think maybe there was one closure early on with the butterfish cap, but not for quite a while. This is, again, one of the early FMPs. It's limited access. There are 3 limited access tiers. Tier 1 starts off with no trip limit. Tier 2, 5,000 pounds. Tier 3, 2,500 pounds. Open access / incidental is 250 pounds. The council went through a permit requalification a number of years ago, and those tiers came out as part of that permit requalification and reducing some of the latent capacity in the fishery. There are some gear requirements, 2 1/8 inch mesh for trimesters 1 and 3, 1 7/8 inch for trimester 2. That was put in, I can't remember the amendment, but trimester 2 was not added to the 2 1/8, was left at 1 7/8 of concern that the squid during trimester 2 can be a little thinner walled after they spawn, and either not so much losing squid, but getting squid kind of plugging up the net and just making it difficult operationally. Current specs, we're at an ABC of 23,400 metric tons. It's been that way for quite some time. That number, 23,400, came from the 2010 assessment that basically said, it doesn't look like there's a problem here. It's still, we don't have like a fishing mortality for longfin squid that's like, this is a good number. So the outcome was look at the range of exploitation indices, comparing the ratio of catch to biomass. The catch in the year with the highest ratio was 93. At that point was 23,400, and that's what was adopted. Assessments since then have re-estimated that catch in that year to be 23,950, but the ABC has just been left alone, kind of like a, if it's not broke, don't try to fix it kind of thing. So assessments, and I put assessments kind of in quotation marks here because it's pretty basic. The survey is scaled up and then double averaged. They take the average of the spring and the fall and then take a 2-year average, and that's basically how they track biomass. And so there doesn't, basically the trends look okay. But again, it's pretty basic. And with that averaging of spring and fall, and then taking a 2-year average of that average, given the squid are only living like 6 to 9 months, it's not really clear how informative that is. But again, the trends don't look problematic. And then if you look at kind of through the history of assessments, you kind of see some different perspectives over time, but I think a lot of that is just, there's a lot of variability. So, a given assessment year happened to see it in the last few years, an uptrend or a downtrend, and kind of had, some assessments historically may have had more or less concern based on where they kind of caught it going up or down. But from what we think now, it's just more or less okay. So, I think big picture, we keep catching longfin, including some banner years. So it's probably doing okay, but also probably not the best possible because of our lack of understanding of that productivity in real time. And it remains possible, I think, that we may always do the wrong thing during extremes. We close when the squid are super abundant because we hit the quota. But we don't limit fishing when they're super scarce because we're not hitting the quota. And again, that's a function of we're trying to track something that has incredible variability in its productivity, possibly on a month-to-month basis. But again, we keep catching some squid, including having some banner seasons. So we have a research track upcoming, and hopefully it dives into that a little bit more. These are the trends in that average of average biomass in the assessment. And again, you can see it looks pretty noisy without any real discernible long-term trend. And in 2022, the last year of the assessment, ending at one of the highest points in that time series. So recent fishery performance, like a number of the mackerel, squid, butterfish fisheries, you can see that foreign fishery early, it was phased out, fishery domesticated. And then we've been in season quota since 2000, which is important because our annual catches, we may not be catching the annual quota, but annual catches in a number of years would have been higher if we had not closed due to the in-season management. Just landings and revenues from 96 to 2022, picking 96 here because our data generally gets better. Then due to some additional reporting requirements that came online at that point. Again, a lot of variability like the resource itself. Prices over that same time, general uptrend, you can see that hit with COVID, haven't recovered from that, but still overall uptrend. Again, these are inflation adjusted. Those annual prices do kind of mask a good bit of intra-annual variability. This came up a little bit in the fishery performance report. Landings at the end of last year kind of flatlined a bit, and we got some input from the advisory panel that prices, part of that was because prices had crashed, and kind of you can see here. So those two dots in yellow are both 2022, and the price was almost half between that high point and that low point. So you get a good bit of intra-annual variability in prices, which are going to drive fishery effort to some degree. Some 2022 landings details by state, not atypical patterns. And by area, again, nothing out of the ordinary. This is just 2022 in blue and 2021 in orange there. I circled August from last year because it was a closure. Again, it would not have been as flat as it was like that had there not been a closure. This is 23 trimester 1 in blue and 22 trimester 1 in orange. So trimester 1 this year in 2023 was pretty low catches. But trimester 2, i.e. now, and we just had a closure of this fishery, was quite a good year, kind of similar trajectory as year before. Garfo staff noted that last week before the closure a couple weeks ago was the highest ever weekly longfin landings, and this also represented the highest ever July longfin landing. So it was a busy July for longfin squid. Again, we asked the AP for their input as we go into the SSC process. And we also kind of remind them of our research priorities to get them to give input on that. So summarizing the input from the advisory panel for longfin squid, they noted that high productivity in early 2022 plus some sluggish sales led to higher inventory. That led processors or dealers to offer lower prices, also demand higher quality squid. That combined with high diesel costs provided some less incentive to fish late in 2022 and early 2023. The advisory panel also notes that there are a variety of area-based limitations, whether it's tilefish closed areas or the scup gear restricted areas or the monument kind of increase their costs or limit their access to areas that reduce landings. Ongoing concern about wind farms. When I was looking at one of just the public online AIS trackers, you could see some of the wind construction vessels just south of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket and the squid fleet. I mean, it was right up against them, part of it for this year. And so there's ongoing concerns with impacts from wind farms, whether it's access or monitoring or disruption of the resource. Ongoing concerns about discards of longfin squid and whether or not maintaining that kind of smaller mesh in trimester 2 continues to make sense. We've been including tables on discards or whatever information we have on discards, been including the fishery information document this year. And there are kind of different perspectives on discards and the AP on this. Some of the AP members say, hey, this is a certified fishery. We've taken a number of steps to reduce discards. Other folks concerned about the discards that do remain. Roughly it varies year by year, but it's about a 1/3 overall discard rate in the squid fisheries. That means for every 100 pounds of longfin squid that go in the hold, about 50 pounds of other fish get discarded. And so those tables are in the fishery information document. I just kind of clipped out the first kind of what I can roughly reasonably fit on a page. So it's a wide variety of species get caught in this fishery, and the full tables are in that fishery information document. Also, the advisory panel flagged that they continue to have concerns about new participants entering in this fishery, either from scallops or groundfish, and also input. They've requested a number of the advisors say, you've got a research track coming up, so please don't kind of change management before then. A bit of input on some of our research priorities. A number of the advisors are kind of would like to kind of see a similar approach taken in terms of some of the lines of research that were done in ILIX, kind of considering what proportion of the resource is likely to be kind of either exposed or not exposed to fishing based on the range of the species and the typical range of the fishery, and some wariness of kind of trying too hard to try to manage the species at a sub-annual level unless we really know what that productivity is like. On the other hand, we have other advisors who say you should really try to dig into that dynamic natural mortality in those sub-annual cohorts to make sure you don't hit any one cohort too hard. And I think that will get a lot of discussion in the upcoming assessment. And then ongoing concerns about what we think about catchability, given at least the current assessment is really kind of keyed in on in terms of the biomass estimates, depending on the catchability of squid in the surveys. And I'll pause for Paul to give his SSD summary.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Very much appreciate the opportunity. As you note, we received a level 2 management track assessment with data through 2022. Longfin squid are in that class of model resistant species. There's no model, there's no none of the subsequent products that follow from the model. So there's no measures of biomass or fishing mortality, OFL, no ABC, and no P star. Despite this absence of sort of assessment information, over time, there's been relatively little trend in the survey abundance indices, and catch levels have been stable over time. So the assessment approach is very much an empirical one, but there are some differences between seasons that suggest that a need for some finer temporal scale models. So one of the things that is likely to be addressed in the upcoming research track assessment is this: are these differences, as Jason indicated, the measures of catchability are kind of paramount. Differences between growth rates in seasons can greatly alter the magnitude of subsequent stock biomass and catch. And then all of these things might benefit by finer temporal scales. But it's also important that we don't pretend we know more than we do. And I think that's sort of one of the sentiments about the in-season management and so forth. So those are some constraints. We did comment on the fact that the trimester system does seem to be doing a very good job of balancing sort of the effects, not only of seasonal differences, but also spatial variability. So its original intention to sort of ensure allocation also probably helps to ensure that you don't overfish any of the cohorts that are coming in. So we've often said 2 cohorts, but there may be more than that in terms of more or less continuous reproduction. So as a consequence, and in light of these observations, the ABCs were set equal to 23,400 metric tons for 24 through 26, excuse me. As this is largely a continuation of past policies, and it's continued because it does not seem to be causing any particular harm, so to speak, to the stock abundance, and there's no downward drift. Like Jason said, we look forward to the results of the research track assessment, and encourage the use of simulation models, encourage exploration of oceanography and various measures of predation, which will address some of these concerns about natural mortality rates, and then of course the very strong seasonal component to this, not only expected growth, but maturity, reproductive output, and factors affecting catch and catchability in the surveys. So with that, I'll end, and happy to answer any questions if they after the presentations. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And I'll add, as I think was in the executive director's report last meeting, the council and the center are working kind of collaboratively on a number of research tasks that should feed into the next assessment. A project looking at some different kinds of models, and that's through the University of Maryland and with the center. We have a contractor who's working up longfin squid biological samples. So the council has kind of, offered to work with the center on a number of research tasks. The center has been really collaborative approach to kind of saying, yes, let's try to make some progress here before the next assessment. So those are all ongoing and hopefully will contribute to next assessment. So the monitoring committee took the ABC from the SSC, basically just a really slight change recommended for discards. The discards have just been looking at an annual average since the trimesters started. So we just added the new years. It changed the percent by a really small amount, and that amount and the percentage when applied to the quota results in a deduction of 506.3 metric tons. So again, based on that, you'd have an ABC of 22,400, and then the initial optimum yield, IOY, DAH, which really kind of are just kind of holdover acronyms and language, but it's really the commercial quota based on that 22,400 and the set aside for discards. The monitoring committee has had a bit of email communication since then, just kind of noting the really robust trimester twos last year and this year. Probably, be exceeded a bit again this year. Some, again, discussion, like, is that an issue? From staff's perspective, I think it's a potential item to look at the future, but it's really not clear at all to the council staff that there's any biological issue from any slight trimester two overages. So yeah, it's like an accounting issue that, yes, it ends up a little bit above that quote unquote allocation, but based on our level of knowledge, doesn't seem like a huge issue to staff at this time. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jason. And thank you, Paul, for your presentation. Does anyone have any questions? Anything for Jason or Paul at this time? Yeah, I don't see any hands in the room. Excuse me. Is there anyone online that would like to ask any questions? Anyone here in the audience? Okay. Can someone just say something so I know there's other people in the room? Peter Hughes, go ahead.
Have a motion if we want to go there.
Yeah, let's take it on.
Okay. The motion is basically what that last bullet point was on Jason's slide. Motion would be, I move that the 2024 through 2026 long-fin squid ABC be set at 23,400 metric tons, and for the initial optimum yield, IOY, domestic annual harvest, DAH, domestic annual processing, DAP, be set to 22,893.7 metric tons. That is my motion. That was not a committee motion, so it would require a second.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Can I look to see if I can get a second for this motion? Dan Farnham seconds the motion. Anything to add, Peter, on rationale, or going with what was reported?
Yep, the presentation said it all, and Dr. Rago's update also confirmed that. Thanks.
Okay, Dan, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Nope, it's been well covered. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, discussion on the motion. Any discussion by members of the council? Seeing none at this time, online or in the room, is there anyone from the public or the audience here that would like to offer any comment on the motion? Okay, seeing no hands at this time, we'll bring it back to the council. I'll ask one last time. Anything to discuss? Seeing no hands, I will simply ask, is there any objection to this motion moving forward? Any abstentions? Seeing no objection and no abstentions, this motion carries by consensus. Was there anything else, Jason, under this topic we needed to cover?
I think that's it for longfin squid. Will note in the briefing materials, we got a letter from Commercial Fisheries Research Institute. They've been kind of continuing to plug away on the potential for jigging in the longfin squid fishery, and kind of had the idea of, it could potentially stimulate interest in fishermen to try jigging if folks could jig after longfin squid fishery closes. And I think it's kind of an interesting idea, worth kind of batting back and forth a little bit with them. Staff will kind of continue to have discussions on that. Again, kind of going into the research track assessment, I think some consistency is warranted there, but I think it is an interesting idea, maybe for kind of future consideration. They've secured some funding. They have with I think a Japanese producer of jigging machines to lend them some machines. Also have like kind of an expert in those machines come over and kind of try to teach some folks how to use. So anyway, I think it's kind of an interesting idea that they continue to churn on, and just kind of highlighting that as another ongoing topic of kind of squid research. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Remember my comments earlier about machines. Gotta keep an eye on things. Okay, so that concludes our business under longfin squid. I'd like to move at this time, if we can, to the next item on the agenda. We're a bit ahead of schedule. We have a discussion or a framework meeting 1 for the Ilex hold baseline. Jason's going to provide us a presentation, and while he's getting set up for that, in the event that we wrap up, we'll take a break after this section of the agenda, and then we have a couple more things to get us to 4:30 today. That's when we plan to adjourn. If we end up getting done sooner before that, it may be an opportunity to do a couple of reports that we would typically give tomorrow, maybe liaison reports, or if you guys are ready for that, and maybe Peter's not going to be ready. We can go through a handful of reports that'll simplify tomorrow and get everybody out of town a little earlier. So just be prepared for that, and you can say no if you're not ready, but I'll probably start calling on folks at some point towards the end of the day today. Okay, Jason, I'm going to turn back to you for framework meeting 1 presentation.
Thank you. So agenda for this topic, review the purpose of the action, review draft alternatives, go over some input we got we had a joint AP committee meeting maybe a month or 2 ago, and then look at those committee motions, and then address any questions and motions and discussion. So quick review of the objective and purpose here. It's to consider requiring a volumetric vessel hold baseline and upgrade restriction for all Ilex limited access permits. Folks will recall we had an action similar to longfin squid, looking at reducing latent capacity in the Ilex fishery that was largely disapproved. And kind of this is a follow-up to that, still looking at capacity concerns in that fishery. And so that is the purpose of the action, to better cap fishing vessel power of the fleet. The kind of introduction of the framework kind of describes, the Magnuson Act itself flags overcapacity as an issue, and there's pretty good literature on the risks from overcapacity in fisheries. There's also a couple alternatives looking at processing type. Those are more really facilitating potential future research, looking at catch per unit of effort. We have a couple different processing types in this fishery. Often for CPUE, they need to be standardized, segmented out by vessel type, and this would kind of facilitate some of that, trying to identify which vessels use which processing type. So no action is always an option. It would just retain the current horsepower and length baselines and upgrade restrictions that pretty much all mid-Atlantic limited access vessels have, at least in mackerel, squid, butterfish anyway. And, again, those exist and they serve some limitation on capacity increases, but with Ilex being a high volume fishery, vessels can kind of stay within those baselines and upgrade their hold capacity substantially to increase their capacity. So that's really the kind of primary alternative related to this capacity. It would be a new hold baseline for all Ilex limited access vessels. They would have to get that hold measure certified. There's a number of entities listed in the document that could do it. It basically just builds out what was set up for mackerel. And the document says that if they already have that for mackerel, that would just be used. And I did get a few numbers from the permit folks, so you can kind of see what that overlap is in a slide or two here. There's, for most vessels in CPH, we don't know what their baseline hold would be. So once they first come out of CPH, that vessel would have to get a certification that would become its baseline. However, the document, as you see now, has built in a recommendation from the committee that if a previous vessel that's in CPH had a survey done already, it happened to have it done, and some vessel owners they were aware of what was going on, and or they had to have it done anyway for other vessels, so they had their vessels surveyed. So if you had a vessel that went into CPH and it has on the books a survey that would meet the requirements, then that would be used. And that was a committee motion. Again, this is really the first time the council has been, this is framework meeting 1, so staff has already built that language into the document as you see in the briefing book. So then also there'd be a 10% hold upgrade restriction, basically matching what's in mackerel. And CPH are kind of permits on the shelf that aren't on a boat right now, but they do have their catch histories or permits documented in a database at NIMS. So there's 76 total limited rights, aka permits for limited access permits for Ilex right now. 6 of those are in CPH. 30 already have hold upgrade restrictions through their mackerel permits. So 30 of those 76 have either a tier 1 or a tier 2 mackerel permit. So they already had to go through the hold measurement and have that as a baseline currently. So roughly you're talking about another 46 permits here that don't already have this requirement, but do have Ilex limited access permits. So the other 2 alternatives 3 and 4 in the document, are this processing type issue. And so it would just be required with permit renewal to identify their intended processing type. It wouldn't be binding. And so if they decided to switch, they could, but it would just be, we'd have on the books an indication of their processing type. And it's 2 kind of separate alternatives / decisions eventually for the council, one for Ilex and or longfin. And again, this is really can be useful for CPUE analyses, just to help identify which processing type, whether it's an at-sea freezer vessel or refrigerated seawater. They have to identify what their intended vessel processing type is. Okay, so AP input. There's kind of 2 camps from AP members. On the 4 side, who generally support this action, they identify ongoing capacity issues given how quickly the quota can be caught. This year and last year, the quota probably won't be caught, and only a small portion of it based on performance so far. But we had a number of years where the quota was caught quite rapidly. And we also have a number of these vessels already have this requirement. So on the 4 side, they say it's a bit of fairness issues given nearly half the fleet already has this upgrade restriction due to their mackerel permits. And then on the against side, I'm kind of saying this reduces our flexibility and ability to modernize if you add another upgrade restriction on us. There's some concern about how that processing type declaration would work. Again, I think the document's clear that it would not be binding. It continues to come up in when we're dealing with squid assessments that it would be a useful thing to have on hand. With the last ILIX research track, we basically talked to industry folks and were able to figure out eventually what all the different processing types were, but this would just, we'd have it on hand. And I think there's more concern about this on the longfin side of things, just have a lot more vessels on the long. I think there might be three or 400 longfin limited access permits. So it's a bigger group of vessels than ILIX. So we had two committee motions. One, that there was a committee motion that if permit and CPH happened to have an existing hold measurement that met the certification requirements that would be implemented in this action, then that hold measurement would kind of come along with them, and that would be used to establish a vessel hold baseline. And that was written into the document as part of the alternative that exists now in the briefing document. That again, if the vessel happens to have that, it would come along. They wouldn't have to get another survey for the vessel that it comes out of CPH onto. They'd be able to. They would use that existing hold survey. And then the committee also passed a motion to generally proceed with framework development. Again, with that modification on if vessels in CPH had an existing survey already done. So generally for framework meeting 1 today, the goal is always to set a range of alternatives and kind of get an endorsement for a continued framework development with either current as is, or if you all decide to modify any alternatives, add alternatives, subtract alternatives, that's certainly within your purview at framework meeting 1. And then, depending on any outcome, in terms of next steps, staff will integrate any outcomes from today, continue to develop the document and analysis in the document. And the intent is to bring the council for framework meeting 2 final action in October. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Excuse me. Okay, so let's see how the council wants to proceed here. I think what we'll do is we can start with questions, but if there are no questions, we can move into establishing whether or not the range of alternatives is adequate at this time for continued development. So we would, the committee met and made a recommendation for one change, but today's the day. If there are other thoughts about adding or taking things away, moving things around, those of you who are on the ASMFC are pretty used to that, especially since last week's striped bass meeting. I had to say it today, but I don't see any hands. Mike Penny.
Yeah, thanks. So I had a question for Jason. I'm just looking for clarification on, you can go back a couple slides, the one that discusses the hold capacity option for vessels that had prior, the previous vessel had a survey. My understanding is the intent here is that if there is a vessel that had a hold capacity certification, so already had a baseline specification, say under the mackerel requirement, and that vessel and that permit, the moratorium right ID went into CPH. When it comes out of CPH, previous baseline spec for the hold capacity would still be controlling, and that would still be their baseline limit. What I'm a little confused about here is well, first of all, just want to clarify that's kind of the intent. But there's 2 circumstances where I could see where a vessel happen to have a survey that we don't necessarily, NIPS doesn't necessarily know about. So there's nothing in our records that indicates that a vessel had a survey done. So if that vessel comes out, if that permit comes out of CPH, does the owner have the option to use their prior survey to apply to their new vessel? Because there's no way, I don't think we could compel them to use that if we don't know about it and don't have it in our records. And so hopefully I'm making sense in my question and can help me understand.
Yeah, I think again, the concern was about a recently sunk vessel, or if there are other vessels that happen to be in a similar situation. And I was under the impression that it didn't have a mackerel, because if it had a mackerel one, that would come along anyway, and you wouldn't need this. So I was under the impression that it was more of an issue of they don't have a baseline, but for under mackerel, but they had a survey done, and in their files, there is a a survey done with a volumetric hold measurement by one of the entities that would likely qualify. If it didn't, then they'd be out of luck. But the mackerel has a wide range of entities that I think industry has kind of become accustomed to using for these kind of things. And so I think you raise an interesting implementation detail. Probably the easiest way to deal with that would be, and I think this could be a clarification that we could add, would be that upon implementation, say any vessels that are in CPH, if you have a survey that meets these requirements, you also can submit that now in this period that it was already there. And again, it would be dated from whenever it was dated, and they'd have that documentation of that, they have to have a contract with that surveying agency. So there may be folks here who know more specific circumstances of these potentially affected vessels that could speak to this. But my understanding was that no, it wouldn't just be a carryover for mackerel, that this was a separate situation.
Yeah, okay, well, thanks for that clarification. That's helpful. But I think also then, and I'm fine with this either way, but I just want to make sure that we're all clear as we move forward on this then. What we're basically saying with this provision is we're giving the vessel owners the option to use a pre-existing survey if they want, because presumably vessel owners are going to make a decision that's best in their long-term interest. So if they had a vessel that sunk that had a survey done on a hold capacity larger than the vessel they intend to put the permit on when it comes out of CPH, they want to use their old hold capacity. If they want to buy a vessel and put their permit on coming out of CPH on a vessel with a larger hold capacity, they might want to get that one surveyed and establish their baseline on the new vessel. So, and I just want to be clear, because if they haven't submitted to us a survey before the vessel went into CPH, I don't see how we could compel them to use their pre-existing survey, but we could certainly give them the option if that's the intent and will of the council.
So, I mean, I think, again, maybe the way to do it is that during that, like, I think with mackerel was about a 1-year implementation period where vessels could obtain the survey and submit it. It seems like maybe the clearest would be during that 1-year period, vessels, if a vessel owner has a vessel in CPH, they, during that 1-year period, would have the opportunity to kind of submit that survey or not. And if that 1-year period is passed, then, and they hadn't submitted that, then it's just going to be whatever vessel, comes out and they put it on. But if they take that opportunity in that 1 year to submit that survey, then they submit it. And then it would be unambiguous at the end of the implementation year. Either they submitted it and that's their hold, or it will be whatever they put it on when it comes out of CPH. That's again, I'm not I don't know which way is better, but that would be unambiguous, and then everything would be kind of clear at the end of that 1 year, I think.
Yeah, I think, and again, I guess all I'll suggest is, since this is the first framework meeting, and we'll come back at a future meeting, if we could just sort of resolve those details between now and the final action of the council, so it's clear what we're setting up, so that when we go into implementation, there's no ambiguity about how we would treat this. I think that would be good.
Okay, that sounds good to me. Lieutenant Commander Kaylee?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the presentation. Jason, I had a question on the enforceability of that. I don't know, we were out doing boardings to see permits, gear, specifications. That's what we're able to do. The fish hold is not something we'd likely be able to do at sea. So I was curious kind of where you saw the enforcement coming into play with this. Is that something that would be contingent upon getting the permit? Based on the survey, they get the survey, then it allows them to get the permit. And when we're able to check them and see, hey, they have the permit that says that this vessel has complied with the specs that are required for that fish hold. I'm just curious on your thoughts on that.
Does Coast Guard currently check vessels' other baselines like horsepower or length?
Underway, it's gear. It's not like get the vessels certified for U.S. documentation. We look at those types of specs, but not from the enforcement side. Underway for living marine resources, fish, squid, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think as described in the document, it's really more, I think it's an issue that if you have a new vessel or you modify a vessel, they have to get another survey. And then that survey that they submit to NIMS has to meet the upgrade restriction. Yeah, I don't think it's really intended for an on-the-water enforcement activity.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Chairman Reed?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, yeah, the CPH question is an interesting question, and one of my questions was about who's going to enforce this, and we talked about this before, and the answer is nobody's going to enforce it. So I'll give you another not so hypothetical situation. Boat has been measured for mackerel. The boat has gone away, but the permit still exists and is now on another vessel that meets the specs for the permit. But now the vessel holds, instead of, let's just pick round numbers, 150,000 pounds of product, now the boat holds 400,000 in tanks for Ilex. So where does the current mackerel spec, hull measurement, fit into an entirely different capability to carry Ilex? How's that going to work? And generally speaking, I mean, I don't see hull measurements on anybody's fishing permit. And honestly, I don't see them on the documentation either. So I don't know where all these numbers are registered other than another piece of paper that says I had survey says. So it's just, not quite so easy in my mind.
Jason?
Yeah, I believe at Garfo for mackerel tier 1 and 2 permits, they have a hold number that is a baseline for those mackerel tier 1 and 2 permits. If an Ilex vessel had upgraded to beyond that, I would have thought they would have had to have given up their mackerel permit in order to do that, because they would no longer, they would have otherwise been in violation of that baseline. Again, I don't know exactly, what kind of track and interlinkage was going on there. But as it's set up right now in the document, and at least the intent, and I can double check that it's clear, if an Ilex vessel has a mackerel hold baseline, that baseline would become its Ilex hold baseline.
Mike?
Yeah, and then, the process would be if someone wants to transfer that permit to another vessel or pull it out of CPH, put it on a vessel, we get the specs on the new vessel. and they have to be within 10% of the existing baseline. So in that case, if the baseline was 150,000, they could give us a surveyed vessel up to 165,000. It's 400,000, we won't issue the permit.
Anyone else want to add to the confusion? Peter? Person to do that for us. Go ahead.
So fishing vessel Alpha, it has already undergone a 10-10-20 upgrade. Fishing vessel Alpha sinks. We're only at a 10-20 upgrade now, but it did the 10-10-20 upgrade years prior. So I buy a new fishing vessel, Beta. Beta has to meet that 10-10-20 upgrade specification? Or are you saying that the second vessel can have a 10% go beyond that 10-10-20 and have a larger percentage? It could be 10% larger in horsepower length. And
Yeah, so let's just, so again, just made up numbers. Let's say a vessel, for whatever permit, has, when we issued the initial limited access permit under the baseline amendment, 100 foot boat. So their baseline was 100 foot, they can go up to 110. They upgrade that boat to 109.99. That boat sinks, they replace it. They're still capped at 110 feet. The new vessel has to be 110 or less. It can't be 121 or something like that. They don't get an additional 10% every time they pull it out. Does that answer your question?
it does, and then I get down the rabbit hole that Eric just kind of went down also. You know, that the one that sunk, it did not have a certified fish hole. It wasn't participating in that fishery where they needed one. But now the replacement does. But not knowing what that fish hole measurement was on the vessel that, you know, had a tragic accident and sunk, the replacement vessel could have, you know, unlimited. So, okay, we got a rabbit hole then.
I'm just staying out of this for now. You guys can discuss amongst yourselves.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I think that's a good clarification that, you know, the baseline remains, right? There's just one baseline, and that permit, at least under current regs, is held to the baseline plus, you know, the original baseline plus whatever the upgrade is, and it's bound to that. A permit is bound to that under current regs. If a vessel has no mackerel tier 1 or tier 2 permit, it won't have a hold baseline, and it may have, you know, increased from whatever to whatever. And now, if this action was approved, it would have to get a survey, and then it would become its baseline. If it has a mackerel tier 1, 2 permit, it should already have a whole baseline, and it shouldn't have been allowed to have been increased beyond 10% of its mackerel hold baseline. That may or may not be the case that was adhered to. We'll probably find out and have some just double check on that. But the idea is, you don't have a baseline now, you have to get a hold baseline. You'd have to get one and then have an upgrade restriction. If you have one now for mackerel, you'd be held to that, which again, they're already held to that.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Okay, so with the conversation here at the table, we're going to have another committee meeting prior to framework number 2 meeting, or to
I mean, we haven't discussed that, whether yes or no. I mean, but I think that could potentially occur if needed.
Okay, so I would support the alternatives that you presented today based on a future meeting, so that we could answer these, it's not minutia, it's, could be much larger than that. And we could try to answer these at the committee level and come back with framework meeting number 2 and maybe explain the alternative and how we addressed the questions that NIMS has, and that others have, presented then, and that would be, final action would be at October or December? Were you looking at? October, I think.
The current plan is October, but I mean, have to consult with council leadership, but it seems like we could probably fit a committee meeting in.
So like I said, I support the current alternatives there that have been developed and presented today. Do you need a motion that says that? Do you need, what do you need? Or is this an update to the council and the council can add and remove alternatives as they seem fit, which is, I think, where we were going.
Jason?
Yeah, I didn't quite follow that question. I think it would be good to get some indication from the council that, you know, you'd like to proceed with document development with the current range of alternatives. And then again, there's understanding that there's some technical clarifications here that, you know, that sounds like you'd like to review it at the committee before bringing back to the council. I don't think that necessarily has to be part of a motion, but it'd be useful for maybe clear intent and picking up on the second committee motion that, you know, this is the range of alternatives, which I think, again, it's an implementation, and it may be important for certain vessels, but I think it's more of an implementation issue than the overall range of alternatives here. So yeah, I think staff would be looking for kind of clear indication from the council that you'd like to proceed with development with this range of alternatives. And again, I think that working out a few of the implementation details can be done at the same time.
Then I'd put that motion forward. Basically, I don't have anything typed up. I don't know if you have anything prepared, but we do want to, you know, answer those technical questions. That's for sure.
So we do have two committee motions. And Stephen, just to remind folks of what those committee motions would be here. So the first one is really kind of contained in the second one now. The first one is addressing that if a previous survey exists, it could be, you know, this actually says it would be used. And I think that 1 year implementation timing that it be submitted would be matching this committee motion. The second motion from committee would be that, again, to proceed with framework development with that modification, right? With the modifications recommended by the committee, that is the modification to allow that, you know, existing survey to be used. That was the only modification identified by the committee there.
Go ahead, Peter.
Thanks, Jason. I just found it on mine also. So this is a motion that came out of committee that if a permit in CPH happened to have an existing volumetric hold measurement that met the measurement certification requirements, that hold measurement would be used to establish a vessel hold baseline. And that was a committee motion.
Okay, so we have a committee motion. No need for a second. Is there any discussion? Mike?
Well, yeah, I mean, just sort of following on from the prior discussion, I guess the word would is pretty ambiguous. And if that was could be used, then we're saying explicitly that it's sort of the option at the, you know, desire of the vessel owner would be used. And, you know, if we mean shall be used, in other words, they must submit it to us, whether they want to use it or not. And I think that should be shall. If we're providing the option at the discretion of the vessel owner, then I think that should be could be used. or may be used or something like that. But it's more clear whether we're mandating it or providing the option. And if we're gonna mandate it, I probably have some concerns about how we enforce that if we don't know that they got the survey done.
Okay, Dan Farnham.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Mike on that one. I think, on the committee level, my intent was that could be used. It would give the vessel owner the opportunity to do that. And following up on the comment on this earlier discussion, if a vessel owner thinks that his mackerel fish hole baseline is constraining his ability to upgrade to a newer or bigger vessel, will he be allowed to relinquish his mackerel permit in order to increase the capacity of his ELEX permit? And in my mind, this covers, if we change that to could, then he would be allowed, or what do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I think on the permit relinquishment issue, I think that's tricky because I think you all know our limited access permits are bundled. So once you have multiple limited access permits or moratorium permits, they're a bundle that can't be severed. And it's, we've run into some of these issues in discussions in the scenario planning work as well. So I want to check the regs, but I'm pretty sure that they could not relinquish one of their limited access permits and keep their other one. And that's why I think you're right, Dan. I think if we make this could be used and provide the option, then it's at the discretion of the vessel owner what's in their best interest in terms of establishing that baseline, because they're establishing it for the first time. If they've got one already established, just like they have a cap on vessel length and horsepower, if they've already got that established baseline that from the mackerel plan that covers their hold capacity, then they have no option. Then that's what's in our record. It's just like back to Peter's question. They couldn't give us a 120-foot boat if their baseline is 110-foot max, because we've already got that in the records. But if they don't have that baseline established yet, this would be giving them the flexibility. At least that's how I'm thinking of it right now, but I could be corrected.
Okay, so there's some thought about the wording of the committee motion, and based on the wording, the intent changes. I did not participate in this committee because I would have understood as much as I do right now. So I'm going to look to the committee chair and other members of the committee to determine whether or not we could correct for the intent, or should I ask for a motion to amend to modify the intent in this case? Peter?
That's what I was going to ask John Alameda, whether, because we're changing the motion and it's committee motion, we have to amend, or can we go in there and change the word?
I think it would be in the best interest of the council to, if this is directly, if anything's changing from would, if we're going to change it to may or could, because intent shifts with those different words, I think we should just do an amended motion. Motion to amend to replace blank with blank. So if that's an option for the council that they want to pursue, let me go to Jason first, and then if that's what someone wants to do, I'm open for that. Jason?
Yeah, it's my recollection. There was some specific wordsmithing on could versus would here. So I think a motion to amend would be in order. And I think it'd be impossible to know whether or not a vessel had this survey. You're not going to go digging through their files. So I think would is problematic and could is less problematic.
Okay. Mike?
I'll make that motion to amend to change would to could.
We have a motion to amend to change the word would to could. I have a second? Peter Hughes, discussion? Joe?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Unfortunately, I missed the meeting as well, but I was curious. I was thinking that one thing you were describing, Mike, was that you may or may not have had something submitted. So if the intent was that it should be used, or shall, the word shall, then the top of this motion would read, an existing volumetric hold measure that was, that is within NIMS's hands already, then it would be used. And then we're dealing with two different things. We're dealing with the instances where you already have that information and the instances where you don't separately. And so unfortunately, I don't know, maybe we can get comments from the public as well, but if the committee's intent was to keep this all as one, then I could support this. But if there was an intent to be in those situations where something was submitted, then I would kind of like to see that.
Jason?
I mean, I think the only circumstance where it would have been submitted would have been for mackerel, and it's already on the books and covered by the mackerel provision. I think this is really the circumstance where the vessel owner has a survey that they might want to use.
Okay. Any other discussion, members of the council? Is anyone from, I'm sorry, Eric, I didn't see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I made this motion at the committee and I thought about it, but, to Jason's last comment, if I happen to have an existing survey that was not submitted, I could buy a shredder and I would run that permit through that shredder. Because if I put it on a bigger boat, the value of the permit goes up exponentially. So I wanted to ask a question about CPUE and the declaration on the permit application, but I won't do that now. If you want to do it later, that'd be fine.
Yeah, we can hold off on that till later. All right, seeing no other hands at the council, let me go to the audience. Is there anyone, are you trying to get my attention, Greg? No, okay. Katie?
Katie Almeida, the town doc. So I'm pretty confused and I've been following discussion. So I'm assuming, and I'm sorry to ask this after you guys have already discussed this, but I'm trying to wrap my head around this. If I have a vessel that does not technically have a certification that has been approved by NIMS already, and I have that in CPH, I can technically choose to either have that certification, that baseline on that permit certified and used for my ILEX vessel, or I can choose to find a vessel that might be bigger and increase my capacity. Is that what we're going with here with this motion? Because I feel like it goes against what we're trying to do with this whole framework of increasing capacity. Am I just way off here?
I'm going to ask Jason.
So I think there's a difference between kind of certification and survey, right? And it's really, there is no certification. There's really two circumstances here. You either have a hold baseline on file with NIMS if you have a mackerel tier 1 or 2 or tier 1 or 2 tier 1 or 2 permit. And those are the only vessels that have anything official on the books for a hold baseline, right? Because they had to submit it for mackerel. And so that would be adopted. Any vessel, whether it's in any permit in CPH or active, if they have that mackerel hold baseline, that would just become their ILEX hold baseline as the documents right now. This is only in the case for a vessel that, for all the other ILEX permits, not the mackerel ones, There is no hold certification for them because they don't have a macro permit, right? There's nothing, the only time you have a hold baseline on file is because of mackerel. These other vessels, if they're an active vessel, if it followed the mackerel model, within a year, they'd have to get a survey and submit that to NIMS, and that would become their baseline. What this issue is if for those non-mackerel vessels, right, those other 46 roughly, and I say roughly because once you start getting into CPH, it gets more complicated, but it's roughly 46. They don't have anything for hold. Right? They've got their other baselines. They have nothing for hold, but there may be some of those vessels in CPH. They have no hold baseline right now, but they have a survey from, say, before the vessel sunk, and they would like to use that survey. So that survey may have been on a 130-foot boat, but if the first time they bring that permit out of CPH is on a 100-foot boat, they're gonna, if this does not apply, they'd have to, their hold baseline would be that 100-foot boat, right? Because that'd be the first boat they put that permit on coming out of CPH. But what they'd like to do is, I happen to have gotten a survey before it went in CPH for my 130-foot boat with whatever its hold was before it sunk, and they had a survey for that. And they'd like to be able to use that survey instead of the hold of the new 100 smaller boat that they happen to put it on. So it's just this like, it's just a case if there's no existing hold baseline, but it's in CPH, and they happen to have a survey that they had done by a surveyor for the hold. They'd like to be able to use that instead of the hold of the first vessel that it comes out on and is put on.
Okay, that clears it up. I guess it's just, it's interesting that we now have a choice. Do you know what I mean? Rather than some vessels are essentially stuck with that hold. And now there's a choice to be able to use between two different holds that you've already had. A choice. That's where I'm going for, is a choice. Like, I mean, I know that in the past I have, I talk about the need for flexibility, and, it comes up when it's important, and sometimes it's considered and sometimes it's not. And now we have, you are able now to have a choice in this. And it's just, when we're trying to, I guess, hold capacity here and, constrain it, it's just interesting that now we can have a choice to maybe in some instances increase it. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. All right, I think I might have a possible solution to the dilemma. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying to respect the fact that we're going down the wormhole on this, but I mean, the only option that I see to Katie's point about giving vessels the choice, I think the only alternative to that is to not allow them to use a pre-existing survey and to force them to get the new vessel surveyed as it comes out of CPH. And I mean, I guess the council could stipulate that, but trying to find a way to work the committee's recommendation into this document, I mean, the only approach I see is to make it an option for the owner bringing a permit out of CPH. But if that was the permit that qualified for the LX permit to begin with, then if that was the vessel that qualified for the LX permit, then you're not really increasing anything, because they're taking a permit out of CPH onto a boat using the pre-existing vessel as the baseline, rather than getting a new vessel surveyed. And you are giving them a choice, but you're not giving them I mean, the only, maybe you are giving them a choice because they could theoretically ignore their old survey and put that permit on a much larger vessel, to Eric's point. But we have no way to prevent that, because if this provision isn't in the document that gives them the choice, then it's going to be the only vessel that's going to form the baseline for that permit is whichever vessel they put the permit on out of CPH, which could be that 400,000 pound hold capacity that Eric's concerned about.
So we're here to discuss a range of alternatives, right? A range of alternatives doesn't mean one alternative. Why couldn't we just take the discussion that we've had about the options, about the flexibility and the inflexibility, and make them two alternatives that we choose from at a later date when there are well thought out examples that we can all digest? I mean, I don't know about the rest of you, but if you're not involved in this on a day-to-day, these numbers they're like, it's like dyslexia all throughout it's all over I mean, you guys understand it, I get that, but I can't follow all the numbers and all the different elements of this. So I'm just going to throw out the idea that we create another alternative set that's less flexible than the one we're considering here. I don't know if that works or not, and then the committee can discuss it. Jason?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think I would I would proceed with this motion here because as, some of the implementation issues, I think it only has possibility of work if that is changed to could. And then the council could just direct to also include an alternative where it's just a vessel that comes out. And then you've kind of addressed both cases here. So I think that's a good idea. But I would still I would still recommend proceeding with this motion here as one of those options as amended.
Okay, let's see what we can do about that. So we have the motion to amend. We've had decent discussion around that motion. We've heard from the public. I don't see any other hands at this time. Is there any objection to the motion to amend? Seeing no objection, any abstentions? No abstentions, so the motion to amend passes by consent. And therefore, we have a new main motion. I'll wait for Jason to get it on the screen. I'll read it into the record and then call the question. There we go. Okay. The new main motion is if a permit in CPH happened to have an existing volumetric hold measurement that met the measurement certification requirements, that hold measurement could be used to establish a vessel hold baseline. That is the main motion. Is there any objection to the motion? Any abstentions to the motion? Seeing none, that motion carries. Now, before we take on the other committee motion, Jason, you mentioned if we were to go down the path of creating two alternatives, one that was just discussed, and if we wanted to go with a more restrictive pathway, what would be the process for us to do that if that's the intent of the council at this time? Or maybe I'll ask Peter, do you think at the committee meeting that would be planned between now and framework meeting 2, there'd be more discussion about another alternative, which then would have to be visited by the council in October for possible framework meeting 3 final decision? I don't know what you guys are thinking about. Peter?
So because this isn't spec setting, I think that it could go till the December meeting for final action. And I think that the committee could, based on the conversation that we've heard here today, put additional alternatives together that we could update the council on in October and then maybe take final action in December. I don't know. Chris just walked away. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know. He gave it a thumbs up.
Take me with you, Chris. Take me with you wherever you're going.
But I'm asking that question to Dave. That work.
Yeah, I think timeline, might have, again, we'd have to see how you end up. But this would be kind of in terms of still getting the range of alternatives, this is kind of the opposite, right? That last alternative was allow use of existing surveys. This would be the opposite, and again, the range, if you want an alternative where previous surveys could not be used. So that could be added to the range, and then again, if it needs a committee meeting, council leadership can kind of plan that out a little bit.
Yeah. So I'm going to call on Mike Petney. I think at the committee meeting, if we plan one between now and October, and we have a number of different alternatives in the document at the time, the committee could select a preferred alternative to bring to the council at the next framework meeting. That's another path forward as well. So I think Mike is going to speak to what's on the screen right now, which is, in Jason's terms, the opposite of what we just did, to kind of to frame out a full range of alternatives, and then we'll go from there. So I'm going to call on Mike. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, the way I'm looking at this, and I think hopefully Jason would agree, is, I'm looking at page 8 of the document, alternative 2, section 5.2, alternative 2. What we would effectively do is create alternative 2A that would include the paragraph that begins, if an LX moratorium permit is on the shelf, and the paragraph below it, if a permit in CPH happened to have an existing volumetric hold measurement, which we just voted on. And then alternative 5 or alternative 2B would be just the first paragraph, which only addresses vessels coming out of CPH for the first time. Then you've got those two alternatives, right? And that way, at least we're being clear and transparent in terms of what we're considering. Option 1 is it's only the first vessel that comes out of CPH, or option 2, whichever order you put them in. Option 2 is the choice of the first vessel that comes out of CPH or the pre-existing survey. And if that's summarized by Jason's very brief one sentence, I could make that motion.
That was my understanding.
All right, then I'll move to include an alternative, we'll call it 2B, where previous surveys could not be used.
Motion by Mike Petney, seconded by Peter Hughes. Mike already spoke to it. Peter, did you want to say anything else? Okay. Arm's getting tired, huh? Okay, discussion on the motion. Seeing no discussion, I got Eric's hand up. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I'm fine with this. I mean, honestly, the example I put up about the 400 and the 165 was on permits that were traded, not on anybody in CPH. CPH, we're talking about 4 boats. So you guys went down the rabbit hole, not me. So I just want to make sure that was clear. But I guess my last point would be, I want somebody to say that the committee would meet to address this, because we've asked for committee meetings before, we don't always get them. So maybe will, as opposed to would, shall meet. The committee shall, would, will, it's like, he, she, me, whatever my pronoun is. But Mike, tell me the committee will meet, and I'll be very happy. Thank you.
Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me, getting all choked up thinking about all this stuff. Let me offer this. We have enough flexibility here that we could deal with this in October as a council or December. We have enough flexibility that we could schedule a committee meeting before our October meeting or before our December meeting. So I would suggest, given the conversation and Eric's last point, that we plan on a committee meeting, schedule that as soon as we can, see how that goes. And if in fact we can wrap things up for October, do that. If not, we'll do it in December.
Perfect. That sounds good to me. Okay. Any other discussion on the motion? Anyone from the public? Is there any objection to the motion? Any abstentions? Seeing none, the motion carries by consent. And I believe there was one more committee motion, but that might be covered in what we just did. Well, we can't modify a committee motion that's Peter.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I move that the council proceed with framework development with the modifications recommended by the council today and whatever today's date is, August 10th, 2023. Because we've modified all the committee stuff.
Right, but let me think. This is a committee motion. So, what's that? You're making a new motion rather than taking up this committee motion. I don't know in Robert's rules if committee motions have to come before the council. I haven't had it in my term of doing all of this. I don't. Yeah, we'll go ahead and do the same thing we did on the last one. Peter, did you want to amend it?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me read the committee motion into the record because I read a modified motion into the record.
Okay.
I move that the council proceed with framework development with the modifications recommended by the committee on June 1st, 2023. That was a committee motion. It doesn't require a second. I don't know if it's in my purview to make an amended motion. So I would like to amend the committee motion.
Okay.
That would say, I move that the council proceed with framework development with the modifications recommended. Scroll back down. By the council today, August 10th, 2023. I can't read the above motion because it's off my screen, but it just mirrors that, except it says council in place of committee. Okay. Same one. Yep.
Before, I'm just trying to figure out where we've amended it, or did we substitute it completely? Let's proceed with the framework development.
I mean, I think it's close enough that, again, if the council approves this motion to amend, then we'll just carry that forward and amend it. And I think it will reflect what you want to do here.
Okay. Sounds good to me at this point. It's clear what the intent is. We'll get the wording right before we take final vote on the main motion. So let me ask for a second. Anyone want to second this? Skip, Beller, going to second this motion. Is there any discussion on the motion to amend? Seeing no discussion, is there any objection? Any abstentions? Seeing none, this motion to amend carries. So we'll get the main motion back on the screen. I'll read it into the record. and then I'll call the question on the main motion. Okay, so we have a new main motion. I move that the council proceed with framework development with the modifications and instruction provided by the council on August 10th, 2023. Is there any discussion on that motion? Is there any objection to this motion? Any abstentions? Seeing none, motion carries by consent with no abstentions. And I believe that takes us to the conclusion of what we were tasked with here today. Correct, Jason?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see what time it is. Okay, let's take 10 minutes, come back. Let's come back at 10 till 3. I'm sorry, Eric?
I'll make it very brief. The request for having vessel processing type, okay, I get it, but you're gonna have to have multiple choices, like you can do frozen, and something else, or fresh, or tanked. It can't just be one. It has to be pick whatever, apply. But my main concern is the comment that particular detail is going to be used to compute CPUE. And I don't think that that's appropriate, because and I won't belabor it, Mr. Chairman, but I don't think knowing the vessel processing type is going to affect CPUE in a positive way. So I'm happy to talk about it later and happy to not talk about it now. So thank you.
Okay, thanks for bringing up that point. We'll take it up at another time. We'll see you all back here at 10 till 3. Thank you. All right, welcome back from break, everybody. Let's go ahead and start up with this last session on this afternoon's agenda. We're going to start with a discussion regarding the research set-aside program redevelopment. We have Brandon Muffley with the council staff who's going to be presenting this information. Brandon, can you hear us okay?
I got you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yep, we got you. You can start whenever you're ready, Brandon.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And thanks, everybody, for my presentation. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. I have one of those life events that I can't miss this week, as I'm part moving person and part crisis counselor as we move our son into his college dorm tomorrow for his freshman year. So lots of excitement this week in the Muffley household. But thank you for letting me present remotely. And so I have a few background slides that I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on. You all have seen, many of you have seen a number of versions of these slides, but I did want to provide a little bit of context and background regarding the RSA program and where the council has been on this issue recently, and then spend a little bit more time on some recent developments over the last couple of months on the program. So with that slide, Stephen, next slide. So just to refresh everybody's memory, the RSA program has actually been around for quite some time. It was developed as framework one to most of the council's fishery management plans. All of them have an RSA component to them, except for CLAM FMP. And the program was really started to address, the research needs that we have for many of our species, and not only to just conduct the actual research that we need, but really to try to increase the science and industry collaboration, get scientists and fishermen working together on science to hopefully build, trust in the information that was going into our management decisions. And so the framework one was approved in 2001, and the first projects were funded through the RSA program in 2002. And those projects were funded by what happened was the council would allocate during your specification setting process anywhere from 0 to 3% of a fishery's total allowable landings. And those landings that were set aside would then be utilized in a number of ways to raise funds to support particular research projects. So next slide. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but I thought this was an important slide to show that really gets into the collaboration that was needed to run the RSA program, the ways involved in ensuring that the program was successfully run, so that council was engaged in the creation of the program and setting aside the allocations and reviewing research proposals. NOAA Fisheries did all of the administrative work from permitting to approving the actual research that was being done, to oversight of the entire program. And then the commission and the states were involved in a lot of that dockside monitoring that was taking place and oversight that was taking place as those boats that were participating in the program were landing that research set aside quota in their particular states. And so next slide. So, over the course of the program, there were a number of program strengths from 2002 to 2014. Approximately $16 million were raised through the RSA program and 39 different projects were funded. And some of those projects turned out to be, really informative to council decisions. Most of them in regards to some of the gear conservation projects, looking at different trap sizes and dimensions. It also played a critical role in funding the Southern New England Mid-Atlantic NEMAP survey as that was getting started. And so without the RSA program, who knows where the NEMAP survey would be today. So it was really critical at that time. And the project really allowed managers to help identify what those research priorities should be. And again, really getting back to the initial reason why the RSA program was funded was to get fishermen and researchers working together to work on critical research needs to support management. However, next slide. We did have those strengths, but we also had a lot of issues with the program as well. And again, I'm not going to go into all of the details of these, but there were, when the program was initially implemented, the costs of the actual program in terms of the administrative and enforcement costs were really not, fully considered. And there was whether or not those costs were beneficial to the overall value that we are getting out of the program. We ran into a number of enforcement issues. We had a lot of falsified documents and from fishermen and dealers that were taking place. We had a lot of underreporting of actual RSA quota that was being landed. There were a number of concerns later in the program for hire vessels were getting into the RSA program and how we could verify the landings that were actually taking place on those for hire vessels. And then there were just the number of vessels participating in the program can continue to grow, and the number of trips that needed to be monitored under the program kept continuing to grow. And there were also a number of research concerns. Some of the projects failed peer review. A number of them did not have any sort of practical application or utility to management. Principal investigators, some of them felt that the program wasn't open in regards to them having a fair shot at getting actual research being done and being, awarded a grant to actually run the program. So there were a number of research concerns as well. So next slide, Stephen. And so given that, all of these things led to the council to suspend the program in 2014. So the program for 2015 never happened because in 2014, the council agreed to suspend the program and revisit and look at the issues and revisit at a later date. So next slide. So that later date came in 2020 as the council was interested in revisiting the RSA program and how we could make potential adjustments to it to bring it back. Given the research needs that we still had for our number of fisheries. And so in 2021 and into 2022, the council held a series of 4 exploration workshops, really to take a deep dive into what the issues were of the old program, talk about potential ways we could address those issues, and come up with some ideas and recommendations on how to potentially move forward with a new program. And so those 4 different workshops looked at all of those critical issues that I presented on the previous slides, looking at research, looking at funding issues, looking at the enforcement, monitoring, and administrative aspects of the program. And then the last workshop was really to look at all of those previous 3 workshops and come up with some recommendations. As part of this entire process, we engaged with our SSC as well. At that time, our economic work group was getting formed, and we thought this was a really good opportunity to pull those folks in. And they were engaged throughout the entire process in regards to the workshops and supporting the research steering committee, providing a lot of technical advice in regards to economic considerations and trade-off evaluations of what a revised program might look like. So those workshops and the input from the economic work group helped inform the research steering committee that as they were working through this process as well. So in between workshops and then following all of the workshops, the research steering committee got together to develop a potentially revised program. And they presented those options for what a revised program might look like to the council. So next slide. And so the research steering committee came up with a lot of different options and considerations. They really dove into all of these particular issues. They revised and reprioritized all of the program's goals and objectives. Again, they looked at, I'm not going to go into any of these in any particular detail, but this is just to show you all of the different areas that the research steering committee really dove into and came up with potential options on how we could create a new program to hopefully address those programs of the old and sort of think about a new way of running the RSA program. So next slide. And throughout all of this, we wanted to make sure, as I showed in one of those previous slides, that, the commission and the states have a really big role in any future program. A number of the recommendations that came out of the Research Steering Committee sort of either provided new or expanded areas of where states would need to be involved in regards to an RSA redevelopment. Things from how and where the RSA program could operate within the states, how you might track the for-hire harvest that's taking place, developing best practices, getting the law enforcement folks across all of the states to work together to develop these best practices. So there were a number of areas under a potentially redeveloped program that would require even additional sort of input and guidance from the particular states. And as if we were to move forward with an RSA program in the redevelopment, depending upon the changes that we were looking at, would likely require management action in the form of a framework. We would also want to do that management action jointly with the commission through an addendum so that they could implement the RSA program for those jointly managed species in their FMPs as well. So next slide. And so all of those events were happening with the Research Steering Committee, and the recommendations were presented to the council in June of 2022. And that's where we sort of dove into all of the Research Steering Committee's recommendations in terms of what a new program would look like. And at the time, the council supported the continued redevelopment of the RSA program. But there were a number of issues that we still needed to dig in on. There was a lot of work to be done, some of these bigger issues in regards to some of the administrative costs and how those could be spread out, how we could support the states in those administrative costs. Some of the monitoring and enforcement issues we still need to dive into. And this Research Steering Committee had identified those in terms of sort of next steps that we might want to address. And so while the states were involved in the workshops and the commission does have a seat on our Research Steering Committee, you know, the full commission really wasn't completely engaged on all of the RSA redevelopment. And before we really went down the paths of addressing some of these other critical research needs, the council really wanted to get the commission's, you know, input on where we stood with things. You know, to see if they supported the redevelopment of the program and how they might cooperate in regards to, you know, implementing the different components of a revised program. And so before we commit a lot of council and commission and state and NIMS resources, not only in the short term in regards to figuring out whether or not we wanted to revise a program, if you did restart the program, there's also a long-term commitment to doing all of that. So before we started any of that, we really wanted to reach out to the ASMFC to get their feedback in regards to the RSA program. So next slide. So the commission's policy board met on July 11th, 2023 to provide input on the RSA program. And we also asked that they provide any potential recommendations for council consideration as well. So I gave a presentation on the RSA program, went into a lot more detail in regards to how the program functioned historically, what some of the Research Steering Committee's recommendations were, sort of focusing on those state components, so that they had a good understanding of where their engagement would be in regards to a new program. So there was a lot of discussion around the table, with a lot of mixed opinions regarding, whether or not we should restart the program, what the potential benefits of restarting the program would actually be. And after some deliberations, they ultimately passed the following motion, and I'll read it just for clarity. So motion to recommend to the Mid-Atlantic Council to consider future RSA programs only for those species that are not jointly managed with the ASMFC. This would preclude RSA programs being conducted for summer flounder, black sea bass, scup, dogfish, and bluefish. And so the policy board felt that this was sort of an appropriate way to move forward. A number of folks expressed concern about the implications and the costs to the states that they couldn't take on right now. That there were all of these sort of enforcement and monitoring concerns, a lot of concerns about the for-hire fleet and how we monitor the harvest that's taking place under the RSA program there. And so by passing this motion, the board, sort of felt that it alleviated those sort of bigger concerns for these jointly managed species, so minimizes the impacts on the states, but would allow for the council to continue to potentially redevelop the program, but again, only for those states that, or for only those species that the council manages by itself. And then the policy board also had indicated that if the council were to move forward with a program, that this would allow the policy board to see how things were working, and if things weren't working so well, they could maintain their current position, or they could reconsider it and maybe want to get on board and sort of bring back those jointly managed species into the fold. And so I will note that this motion by the policy board is a recommendation. It's not necessarily binding to the council and what you all want to do moving forward. But I think it's a pretty clear indication from my perspective in regards to where the states are on this issue and where the commission may be at large. So next slide. And so what are the implications of the motion that was passed by the policy board? I mean, really, to me, without the states and without the commission's support and participation in the program, it's really going to be challenging to implement a new program. They do all of the sort of dockside monitoring and a lot of those things that are taking place in regards to some of the state permits that need to be handled, tracking quotas and dealing with those things, carrying out all of the law enforcement that's taking place. And so without state engagement in doing those things, I think it's going to be really challenging to start up a program. And maybe just as important, without having those jointly managed species, the amount of funds that are going to be generated for research are going to be extremely limited. You can see by this figure on the right-hand side, this is just from 2014, but nearly all of the funds raised, and this is similar across all of the years. So this is only 2014, but you could look at this across all of the years that RSA was in place, and it's a similar picture that almost 90+% of the revenue came from summer flounder and black sea bass, and then scup, bluefish, and dogfish accounted for another 5% or so. So 95% of the funds raised were from jointly managed species. So you pull that funding away, it's really going to limit the amount of research that's likely going to be done, and change how we really functionally think about an RSA program. And with those changes, the Research Steering Committee developed this entire framework and the different program elements. From my perspective, that would all need to be reviewed and revised, because the operation of the program, the species that would be left are, primarily, federal fisheries that are commercially dominated, with different gear types. And so thinking through how we would support a program for a different sort of fish, for different fisheries, I think is going to be warranted, and potentially maybe something that's more similar to the New England Fishery Management Council's RSA program, where they have that for 3 species: scallops, Atlantic herring, monkfish. Those are all federally managed fisheries, primarily all commercial in scale. Scallop RSA only supports scallop research. Atlantic herring RSA only supports Atlantic herring research, et cetera. So if the council were to do something for our council-only species, I think something more in line, or at least consider something more in line with the New England Council program might be, a way to go, but it would definitely need to be different from what the Research Steering Committee was originally putting together. So next slide. So given all of these challenges and the anticipated resources needed to develop a program, and the limited viability, I think with actually successfully carrying out a program, given the funds that we may or may not be able to generate with the council managed species. From a staff's perspective, the staff is recommending that we continue to suspend the RSA program, but we maybe need to focus, and this was a discussion at the policy board, as well as maybe prioritize cooperative research and sort of work with our partners to find ways to elevate cooperative research and find funding sources to address our council's research needs. So that's the staff recommendation. Next slide. And so really today the plan was really just to give you all an update on where we are. And certainly there's some big recent developments in regards to where we are at with the program. So that's sort of a snapshot of what's taken place since you all have, talked about this in June of last year. And, looking for any council feedback that you might have on the program and where we might want to go. And with that, I'll take any questions, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks, Brendan, for your presentation. Could you go back one slide? I think the staff recommendation slide really sums up where we currently stand. And before I turn to folks around the table for questions, I think I'd like to hear some feedback about whether or not this council supports the staff recommendation or concurs with what's being recommended here, or is there another action that the council would like to see take place? It is really important, as mentioned by Brandon, that our partners with ASMFC in the states, they play a critical role in this. And as we saw from the note or from the motion that was passed by the commission, the states generally were not supportive of continued RSA work outside of what council managed species we have that are independent of joint action, but with the commission. So let's take a look at the staff recommendation, and I'll offer an opportunity for some questions for Brandon at this time. Right now in the queue, I have John Clark, then Joe Semino, and then Michelle Duvall. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that summary, Brandon. I was at that policy board meeting and I believe voted for that motion. But one thing I was thinking about afterwards, and I know you've discussed this much more in depth at the council, I was just wondering whether the idea of like a reserve price for a auction, like where if you factored in how much enforcement, how much funding you'd need for enforcement and for research could be kind of put on the table first, and that way you could look at what a minimum acceptable auction price would be when you went to auction the RSA off. And if the reserve was not met by any of the bids, that RSA would just go back and be distributed the way it always is. I'm just curious if something like that was legal.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think it's somewhat difficult to say, we, the council and National Marine Fisheries Service, don't have any specific say over how any auction would necessarily be run. I mean, the Research Steering Committee talked about the auction a lot and sort of a third-party process, and we talked about developing guidelines for an auction and those sorts of things, but none of that would really be binding on somebody that would utilize the auction to generate their funds. Again, it's really up to the principal investigator for how they want to raise funds. They can either just work, cooperatively with a particular vessel or suite of vessels and agree to price of how much, the quota that the principal investigator got, and they could agree on what that price should be, and anything that comes over that, supports the research, or it could go to an auction to raise those funds. And once it moves to the auction, it gets a little bit different or challenging in terms of what say we have. So we've thought about a few different things, and some of the money raised under the auction the last time, I believe, did go to support some staff help in New York. And so there is the potential, I guess, for some ways, but whether or not the auction and the people that administer that are sort of required to do that, that's another story.
Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, I was just curious as to, it seems like with some guidelines like that, you'd know right away whether it was worth pursuing, auctioning off the RSA. If it wasn't going to bring in enough money, you could just turn it back to distribute the quota in the normal way. Otherwise, you could auction it off. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, John. Joe Semino.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess you had mentioned feedback, so I really don't have questions. I have feedback. Okay. Well, thank you, Brandon, and good luck this week. Can you please go to the slide that had the species? That 2014 slide would work. That showed the species and bringing in money. Yeah. So I also was part of the ASMFC vote. Setting aside all concerns for how states would be part of the management process for this. If you look at the species that we're talking about, especially the jointly managed species, for flounder, scup, and sea bass, we have concerns with dealing with OFL already. So they don't seem to me to be in a place of research set-asides necessarily when we have, two groups that are discussing transfers amongst themselves. That's pretty contentious. Dogfish, I think, has two issues. One being that it's not a high-value species, so even if you were able to set aside quota, it might not generate much to do research on. And now we have concerns with the stock. Bluefish is in rebuilding, so I think it really knocked out the ASMFC, or should I say the jointly managed species, without even talking about could we proceed, as states in helping out manage this. And so I wanted to bring that to the forefront because I certainly had hopes to see the program come back, but I just don't know that this is the time to do it. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great point, Joe. There are other forces of nature involved in this other than just the decisions by managers. Dr. Michelle Duvall, I have you next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, I listened to the recording of the policy board meeting, and, I certainly am not surprised by the vote that came out of the commission. I guess I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little bit disappointed that perhaps there wasn't, I don't really feel like with that vote that we have an opportunity to, further investigate some of the potential options that the committee had, had put forward as possible solutions to provide administrative support to the states, or, consider things like whether or not opting in or out of an RSA program was viable. And, I do think it would be extremely difficult to move forward. What Joe has pointed out is, yet another reason, but I think it would be extremely difficult to, try to move forward without consideration of some of the jointly managed species, just given, the value and some of the stock concerns we have for others as well. So, and, maybe I think one of the things I had sort of thought about was, maybe there was some potential, for ELIX, probably the last couple of years, but I think the unpredictability of that fishery makes it very difficult, as a candidate. I mean, not everybody's going to have a scallop RSA program. I mean, it is kind of the gold standard, and it's, an ideal fishery for that. So, Brandon and I had a chance to chat about this, and, I do support his recommendation. I don't think that precludes the council from, taking the body of work that's been conducted by the committee and, using that at a time in the future when perhaps, the environment is a little bit more ripe for, redevelopment of of an RSA program, or I guess maybe continuing to move forward if circumstances change. So appreciate the time. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And to your last point, Michelle, Brendan made it clear that there's nothing from the commission's vote that's binding to what we do. It's I don't know what term he used, recommendation, but it's not something that the council's bound by. And the suspension of the program for some period of time while the stocks figure out where they're going to, we could certainly pick this up again if we wanted to as a council.
Right. And so, I mean, that's what I said as well, that we can pick it up in the future. But I think, we have a lot of other issues that we need to work on with the commission. And so while this is not a binding recommendation, I mean, we would want to do that with, the willing partnership of the commission for those jointly managed species if they were to be considered. So I guess I'm trying to be respectful of what, the vote that was passed at the commission last week. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Mike?
Yeah, I guess I was somewhat disappointed by the commission discussion just mainly because taking out the primary funding sources in terms of the higher value species. But I guess two questions related to that is I guess it's not technically binding on the council, but I'm not sure how it isn't binding on it because ultimately both bodies have to agree to the same, our intent is that both bodies agree to the same quota for summer flounder, scup, and sea bass and bluefish. And so if the board doesn't agree to a 3% set aside, say for summer flounder, how do we move forward? So it does seem in some respects binding on the council in the sense that the commission wouldn't support that 3% set aside when it comes time to set specs. My second question, though, is kind of related to we can continue to look at this and wait for things to resolve or hope that things resolve. Like, it's not clear to me what would have to happen for the commission to say, okay, now it's ripe. Now we're ready to reconsider an RSA program that involves these species. I don't think we have any clear guidance for what the commission or the policy board is looking for. And that makes it super difficult. Difficult to know how to move forward if we don't know what remedies or things to explore to address the concerns.
Okay, thanks, Mike, for those thoughts and comments. Going to go to Peter Hughes next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am a big supporter of RSA, and that's because I've had great success with it and been involved in the scallop RSA since its inception. But I hear the comments that are made around the room, and I can't help but agree with them. And, Brandon's presentation that was given today, I agree with that also. And just like Mike said, what are the triggers that would, if we continue the suspension of the RSA, what are the triggers that would kind of bring it back to the table? What's the mechanism there? But given that we don't have those answers, I support the staff recommendation. Thanks.
Okay, Peter, thank you. All right, I've got a couple of other hands that have surfaced here. Dan Farnham, and then Maureen Davidson. You're after Dan. Go ahead, Dan.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. A quick question for Brandon. On this slide, that $800,000, how many pounds of summer flounder were auctioned off to attain that value? Do you know?
I don't know off the top of my head, Dan. I mean, I'm assuming we could get that because we could look back at 2014 and look at what the TAL was, and each time that the council and board approved it, it was usually the full 3%. So we could go back and get that, but I don't know what that was off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, thank you. My point would be that don't forget, these values are inflated. These auctions were, per pound, people were paying a lot more to lease these fish than what they were actually worth. You took away all the concerns with harvesting illegally, you know, like that you wouldn't attain near this value if this auction was done properly. That's my point. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Maureen?
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon. I also was disappointed at the outcome of the vote and the recommendation that came from ASMFC. No state wants to really return to the way the RSA program operated 10 years ago. And I was hoping that the council would be able to come up with an alternative type of RSA program in which we would be able to eliminate a lot of the negatives that were described in Brandon's talk, in his presentation. I mean, there are things about the program that I did not like, and this was an opportunity for the council to pretty much design a new RSA program, to decide if we were going to use an auction to fund research, which was successful, especially for NEMA. But there were negatives, and yes, New York experienced a lot of the negatives, which I also do say does require a commitment from the state to improve law enforcement, improve enforcement, and administration of the program. By recommending that we remove the species that are managed by both parties, it pretty much eviscerates the program. We really don't have anything to work with, and now we can't design an RSA program that possibly could work. I think that the council had an opportunity to say who would be eligible to be in the kind of program, whether it be party charter, just commercial fishermen. I think we just had an opportunity to design something that could work. And it would have been in cooperation with all of the states. And so I have to say, I am disappointed. I understand where Brandon's where staff recommendation comes in. It's kind of like there's no other place to go. I just believe that we have missed an opportunity to perhaps develop something that would have been very good and probably very beneficial for our fishermen. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, thanks for your thoughts and comments, Maureen. Is there anyone else from the council that would like to provide any comments or any questions for Brandon? Bob Beal.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up a little bit on Mike Pentney's comments, last question about, when would the states be comfortable, or what would the trigger be to bring this back forward? And as Mike said, they didn't really articulate that at the meeting that the policy board had a little while ago. But what they did say was they felt it's easier to go find some money to do cooperative research and fund this through a different source of funding than through an RSA. And they committed to make that a priority within the commission's lobbying efforts and other things on Capitol Hill to move forward. The commission very much realizes there's a lot of important research for these jointly managed species in particular that needs to be conducted, and they felt it was probably more effective to go try to find some congressional funding, other sources of money, than it was to try to revamp the RSA program and deal with all the administrative pieces of it. So, and then the other part they talked about a little bit was that, crafting a new RSA that put additional restrictions on who could participate. Is it only one sector? Is it, you can only land at certain times in certain ports? Is it, reduced speed? All the restrictions you put on it to make it more enforceable and easier to administer at the state level also shrank the pool of individuals that might participate in the auction, which devalues or reduces the value of the stock, of the set aside. So, those few things combined, and, you guys saw the motion, but I think the commission and the states are committed to working on finding some money to do cooperative research.
Mike?
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Just two kind of thoughts in reaction. I think one of the things that was good about the RSA program, it was consistent. You know, it was within the control of the commission and the council to say, we're going to set aside X amount of pounds each year, and we will be able to have and fund this research. The expectation that we can go to Congress and get appropriations and that that's somehow going to happen year in, year out, at the amounts that we want. I don't know, it seems a little naive, I think, given that it's completely outside of our control. The other issue that, you know, has been a sort of source of continuing frustration is that there were several years where there were a lot of issues. I think everybody remembers those and everybody recognizes them. But we, you know, the agency working with several states and with our enforcement, you know, arm, put a lot of effort into measures to address those enforcement issues and the abuses that were going on. We never got a chance to implement them because the program got suspended. And now sort of we continue to hear that the reason for continuing the suspension is, oh, well, there were all these problems 10 years ago. And I don't feel like if we just keep saying there were a lot of problems 10 years ago, we don't want to have a program again and have that happen again. We're never going to get out of that box. We're never going to have the opportunity to show that we can run a program and not have those same enforcement concerns. So I don't know how to get out of this. And I definitely, I mean, I support the staff recommendation because absent the kind of money species, if you will, there's really no reason to have an RSA program just for a couple of species, but it is disappointing.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I'm going to go quickly to the public. I don't see, are there any hands in the audience? Emerson, I do see your hand. Emerson's a member of the ASMFC. I'll go to Emerson first, and then we'll see if anybody here in the audience wants to weigh in. The mic's yours, Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to comment here this afternoon. I have a couple of comments. One, just to quickly address John Clark's question. While the council and NIMS do not have direct control over price or minimum price on an auction or any other means of raising funds from allocated fish, NIMS and the council can review proposals on the basis of the PI, including a budget item to help fund activities within the states for law enforcement and tracking and administrative burden. So there is an indirect method there, although not direct, there is indirect. I also participated in that policy board meeting. And as most people know, I've been a long supporter of the RSA program. And I'm disappointed that I couldn't convince enough of my fellow commissioners to support full redevelopment of the program. And I agree with Maureen's comments and with Mike Pentney's comments here this afternoon. Also, when you look at the vote by the policy board, I'll just note that most of the votes opposing redevelopment were from states outside of the geographic boundaries of the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council. And in fact, the motion that was passed was made by a state outside of the or outside of the boundaries of the Mid-Atlantic Council. And much of the resistance to reevaluating the RSA program revolved around the for-hire participation and concerns of the states about tracking that for-hire participation. And unfortunately, the states did not want to even see what the output would be from the Research Steering Committee process that they're going through to try to address those. So that's it's quite disappointing. But I want to thank the Research Steering Committee for all of their work supporting the redevelopment of the RSA program. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Emerson. If I could ask, I don't know who's in control of the slides. It's either Stephen or Brandon. Can you go to the staff recommendation slide? There we go. I haven't heard while I've heard folks say they're disappointed with the outcome, there has been nobody that has fully objected to the staff recommendation, and there seems to be support around the table for the staff recommendation at this time. So in order to keep us moving forward, I will ask the council at this time, is there anyone who wants to speak in objection to staff recommendation, or can I consider this to be a consensus reached by the council for following along with the staff recommendation? Although many are disappointed, this is where we stand at this time. Seeing no hands for objection, Brandon, I wanted to thank you for putting this together for us and staying on top of it, and thanks to the Research Steering Committee for all their work and effort, and we'll see where this goes in the future. Brandon, is there anything else to come before the council on this matter today?
Nope, that's it, Mr. Chair.
Okay. I believe you are up next again, right, for the last item on today's agenda?
That is correct.
Which is a presentation on the advance notice of proposed rulemaking for National Standard 4, 8, and 9 comments. So I'll ask Brandon if you're ready to go. You can just jump right into that.
All right, great. Stephen just pulled it up. All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a relatively short presentation. I'm going to go into the details of the staff memo that was as supplemental material under this tab and run through, give an overview of the ANPR and sort of what National Marine Fisheries Service is looking for, and then I'll run through some draft comments for your consideration. So next slide, Stephen. Okay, so the ANPR was released back in May, and it's looking for input on whether or not the guidelines for National Standard 4, which deals with allocation, National Standard 8, which deals with communities, and National Standard 9, which deals with bycatch, need to be revised to improve management. And so it's been a while since these three national standards, since the guidelines for these three national standards have been updated. It's been 25 years for National Standard 4 and 15 years for National Standards 8 and 9. So given the amount of time since the guidelines have been revised and sort of the amount of change that we're seeing, particularly on the water with climate impacts and the management challenges that we're facing to address all of those, National Marine Fisheries Service thought it was good to look at these and see if changes are necessary to the guidelines. And they're really focused in on two broader areas of interest within these three national standards. One is looking at how the guidelines might need to be modified to reflect climate-related impacts, in particular changes to stock distribution. And then the second area of broader interest is, considerations for equity and environmental justice. And so next slide. So just to dive in a little bit more, and I will say that the council had received a presentation on this by the National Marine Fisheries Service at your June council meeting. So you got a lot more detail in June, and so I'm not going to go into that much detail, but I just did want to refresh your memory in regards to where NIMS is looking for comments, so that you had that in the back of your mind when we look at the draft response, look at the draft comments that we've put together, so that you know where we're going at with them. So I'm not going into a great amount of detail here since you've seen this already, but just a quick refresher. So in regards to National Standard 4, again, under Magnuson, National Standard 4 states that allocations need to be fair and equitable. They need to promote conservation, and they need to not result in excessive shares to one entity or one individual. So in regards to National Standard 4, when we're looking at the climate related impacts, the National Marine Fisheries Service is really interested in looking at allocation approaches that consider distribution changes and access to historical, marginalized, excluded, and new entrants. So thinking about new ways to look at allocation, ensure that any allocation decisions sort of look at and appropriately look at things fair and equitably across all of these different user groups. Whether or not the guidance needs to be changed under allocations to reinforce NIMS allocation policy in order to conduct reviews. I will remind you that as part of the NIMS allocation policy, each council was required to implement an allocation policy. So we have one that does provide triggers for when allocations need to be reviewed by each council. And then their third area of focus is identifying any potential analyses or approaches that would support allocation decisions. So that's what they're looking for there in regards to National Standard 4 for climate impacts. Looking at EEJ comments, they're looking for sort of opportunities or approaches to improve the considerations of underserved communities, previously excluded participants, and any new entrants into any allocation decisions going forward, and any sort of information or analyses that we could do when we have allocation decisions to ensure those decisions are fair and equitable. Next slide. Under National Standard 8, for climate-related comments. So National Standard 8, just to refresh your memory, states that any regulations or fishery management plans need to consider the impacts of communities, provide for sustained participation. That phrase will come up in some of our comments later, and minimize any adverse impacts to the extent practicable on communities engaged in fishing. So thinking about that, the climate-related comments they're looking for are opportunities to better account for climate impacts, again, looking at and including changes in stock distribution to increase the adaptability of fishing communities to respond to these changing stock distributions and access to those stocks. And then for EEJ comments, they are looking for potential revisions to the definition of what a fishing community actually is. And then looking for suggestions on how we might balance sustained participation with the need to consider underserved and vulnerable communities when we make allocation decisions. Next slide. And then under National Standard 9, again, under Magnuson, it states that regulations need to minimize bycatch and bycatch mortality to the extent practicable. The ANPR does state that, you know, as climate change continues to affect stock distributions of target and non-target and protected species, those changes may be contributing to bycatch problems and why they're thinking about this particular issue. And so are there ways that we can account for the changing distribution of these particular species due to their distribution changes? And then for EEJ comments, are there ways to minimize bycatch that's equitable across fisheries and across gear types? So how can we apply bycatch minimization across our fisheries and gear types that are engaged in the fishery? And how can we balance the needs of target and non-target species equitably across fisheries and gear types? So hopefully that set the stage, a little primer for where we're going with our comments. And next slide. So the draft comments that I have, I've sort of binned them into the different categories that I just presented. So under all of the different national standards and then those particular areas of focus. And so all of these comments that I've put together for your consideration were either comments that were generated by the council during your June meeting when it was presented initially to you all, or staff took a deep dive into the ANPR and provided our comments as well for your consideration. So that's what I'm presenting to you today. First, I think I wanted to present these. These are some of the comments that sort of go across all three national standards that we're looking at. And so these are some of the broader overall take-home comments so far. And so the first one is a more clearly specified definition of underserved communities, particularly as it relates to fisheries. So there is this broad definition, and it was given to you at your June meeting, of what underserved communities is, but what does it mean for fisheries? What does it mean for fisheries in the Mid-Atlantic? Can we define what underserved communities are within the Mid-Atlantic region? And so the comment was, and I think this again applies across all of the three national standards, because this addressing EEJ issues and underserved communities is something that's across all of them. Can we get a better picture and a better idea of what underserved communities are within our region? That will help us give a better picture of how the council needs to respond and making sure that we're addressing those needs. The council did note that maybe one of the underserved communities to be considering is the broader commercial, fishing industry. That industry has been changing over time in regards to aging and shrinking, and it's heavily regulated. And so are there opportunities to look at these national standards through the way we can support the commercial fishing industry in a broader sort of context. The next comment was, if National Marine Fisheries Service does deem that they're going to go forward with rulemaking to make some changes to the guidelines for these three national standards, comments were sort of, this is tied, I think, a little bit to bullet one, that identifying what are the deficiencies within our current management process. So how are we not, through the existing guidelines for these three national standards, how are we not meeting those current guidelines now? And if changes are made, what are the potential impacts to our fishery management plans if the guidelines are changed? So again, providing some specific examples of how these potential changes to the guidelines might impact our fishery management plans. And while there was some general support of some minor adjustments to definitions and some minor tweaks to add some greater clarity for some of the areas, I think the really broad take-home point was that the existing guidelines that we currently have provide the council with sufficient direction to deal with climate-related impacts, to deal with EEJ considerations, and so that the guidelines really should remain largely unchanged. We don't want to lose the flexibility that we currently have by making something more refined. So next slide. All right, so now specifically within National Standard 4, again, so I have these overall comments within National Standard 4, and then specific comments on climate-related comments, and then EEJ comments. So overall comments, that if you are going to potentially change the guidelines when we're thinking about allocations, that we just need to be, I think it was pointed out, really need to be careful for additional guidance in terms of how we account for new entrants to our fisheries, particularly for our limited access fisheries, our IFQ or ITQ fisheries. There's been a significant focus of fisheries management to sort of reduce the overcapitalization in many of our fisheries to promote stock rebuilding. And so now that we have limited access to our fisheries, we've sort of created some barriers and limited ability for new entrants, but bringing new entrants in is likely going to affect the existing participants within our limited access fisheries. So making sure we're really thinking through any potential changes to allocation for those fisheries in particular, I think is warranted. There's a general comment that really didn't see a need to modify the guidance to reinforce the NIMS allocation policy. It just seems unnecessary. Again, as I mentioned, each council has its own allocation policy as well, with triggers that require us to look at allocations on a specific time frame. So really didn't see a need to sort of change guidelines to sort of reinforce the broader NIMS allocation policy within this. Specifically to climate-related comments, there was, that all of our past allocation decisions have been deemed to be fair and equitable. And so I guess there was some current concern by the council and staff that is this suggesting by changing this that maybe these decisions, our past decisions, are not considered fair, considered, that the decisions are now considered unfair. And so maybe some clarity in terms of where we may be going with this, I think was suggested. Again, similar to our overall comments, that the existing guidance allows for, allocation decisions to consider changing stock distributions. The Mid-Atlantic Council has considered this in a number of our management actions and recommended allocation decisions that consider climate-induced changes. So this is already taking place under our existing guidance. So is something additional warranted? And I think there's somewhat of a concern that sort of more prescriptive guidance could make sort of future analyses and evaluations more difficult. That sort of broader flexibility is really necessary to help support our decisions and our evaluation. There was mention about the applicability and relevance of historical information and current regulations, right? So National Marine Fisheries Service has indicated that as stocks are changing, that maybe historical information and current regulations may not be as important in some of our decisions, but that we had comments that while that is true to some regard, sort of historical information and the regulations that were in place sort of drove how the fisheries responded and play a critical role in sort of how our fisheries evolved over time. And so losing out on historical and what the regulations were at a particular time should not be lost, even though stocks may be shifting. And then a comment about any allocations that do have a spatial component, some greater clarity in regards to what location elements are, right? So there are differences between, historic and current locations of catch, of current and historic locations of effort and harvest. And depending on how you evaluate those, you could have different interpretations of what might be fair and equitable in terms of allocation decisions. So there was a suggestion to get some greater clarity on those location elements we might want to consider. Next slide. For the EEJ comments related to National Standard 4, again, looking for some more information or clarity. How do EEJ considerations promote conservation? That's, one of the components of allocation decisions. It needs to support conservation. And so how do EEJ related decisions here within allocation promote conservation? Again, providing some examples. How have underserved communities or marginalized individuals been excluded in our current allocation process? If we don't know how they've been excluded in the past, how do we correct for that in future allocation decisions? And so providing some greater clarity with some regional examples of if this is an issue, providing some of those very specific issues so that the councils can understand how to correct and address those things in the future. Again, going back to our broader theme that the existing guidelines already seem aligned with EEJ goals, that we can already account for these particular areas and making sure that our allocation decisions are fair and equitable. And so there's a concern that more prescriptive guidance could create more challenges, more concerns about how we utilize data to make those decisions. And so keeping things broader would be more beneficial. And then instead of addressing underserved communities through changing the guidance under National Standard 4, there was a suggestion that the NIMS should actually do more outreach and engagement and get more diverse sort of group within the council process. So more diverse and underserved communities on our advisory panels or becoming council members. And that's a way to ensure we have fair representation versus changing the actual guidance itself. Next slide. All right, I have fewer comments on National Standard 8 and 9. So National Standard 4 on allocations, we had the most comments, and we have these next two slides will go a little bit quicker. So on National Standard 8, the overall comment was, so one of the things that NIMS is proposing in this ANPR is removing language that states it does not, that the definition of a community does not constitute a basis for allocating resources to a specific fishing community, nor for providing preferential treatment based on a residence in a fishing community. So NIMS is proposing to drop that language from the definition. And so comments where it's unclear like what the implications are if we were to drop that particular language from the definition. So it's hard to provide comments, meaningful comments in regards to what we should or shouldn't do in regards to dropping that, because it's not clear what the potential implications are with dropping that. In regards to climate-related comments, again, the comments were that the current guidelines are sufficient really to address climate effects on communities. We are currently doing it now, and there's really no reason to change the guidance in regards to addressing climate impacts for National Standard 8. When it comes to EEJ comments, so there's a general support. This is again part of this broader fishing community definition, and the feedback was there's some general support for making some minor modifications to what fishing community is, but there's concern that making it either more nebulous or unclear is going to create for decreased flexibility and adaptability going forward. Again, this is a theme we've kind of been hearing throughout. And then NIMS is also proposing within the ANPR that the fishing community definition, so right now it includes dependence and engagement are both areas for consideration within a fishing community. How dependent is a fishing community and how engaged in a particular fishery is the community. And so they are talking about within this about sort of shifting the weight of this to making it more aligned with engagement and not so much on dependence. And so the comments are that both are in the Magnuson definition. We should be considering both. Both are equally important, and they are very, fishery specific. And so the comments are that we shouldn't be favoring one of these over the other, that we should balance both dependence and engagement of our fishing communities in any of our decisions. But if NIMS were to move forward with making engagement a greater priority, that the recommendation is to provide a clear definition of what engagement is and how we would evaluate that in future decisions. Next slide. Okay, and then for National Standard 9, the overall comments here are, it's really unclear how revising the guidelines are going to incentivize industry to utilize bycatch. Comments were that really market conditions are going to determine sort of the opportunities to utilize bycatch, and it's going to fall down to a business decision in regards to those. So how will guidance here sort of influence or incentivize bycatch uses? One of the suggestions was where bycatch cannot be reduced or eliminated, that the guidelines should include opportunities to reduce waste. So maybe more opportunities or some guidance in regards to how we can reduce waste. In regards to climate-related comments, the feedback was that any guidelines should include additional flexibility and approaches to how we handle choke species, or how we think about more ecosystem, either EAFM, EBFM approaches. So taking things at a more holistic approach and ways to reduce bycatch at more of a multi-species level instead of just looking at a species by species or FMP level, maybe looking at ways to consider reducing bycatch at a broader perspective. And then also including that any guidance should include elements that promote flexibility for industry. So allowing fishermen to, sort of switch or retain non-target species. So the ability to take advantage of bycatch for some of these non-target species, ensuring that we have some flexibility either through permits or their ability to land a particular non-target or choke stock during those things. And so just opportunities to promote flexibility, I think, is the key takeaway comment here. And we didn't have any, you all didn't provide any, and staff didn't provide any specific EEJ related comments for National Standard 9. And so next slide. Last slide. So really for the meeting today is for you all to provide feedback on the draft comments. So I ran through most of the comments that were in our memo. There's a few more that I didn't touch upon that were maybe not as big of an issue, or there's more detail in the memo itself. Identify any new or additional comments that we didn't touch upon today. And then based off of the feedback that you have, I'll utilize what's in the memo and any feedback that you all provide at our meeting, and we'll submit a letter to National Marine Fisheries Service by the comment deadline on September 12th. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions and happy to hear any additional feedback that we might want to consider for a letter. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. So I'm going to look around the table to see if anybody has any questions, but we'll also take comments at this time. If there are any additions or changes to the comments that Brandon presented so far, now's the time to provide that input. Michelle Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Brandon, for the thorough review, and thank you to you and staff for consolidating this and putting it all together. I think the one thought that has occurred to me as I was reading through all of those is specific to the request for input on engagement and dependence and sort of and shifting that. And one thing that has occurred to me is that if you shift that towards engagement, I mean, engagement in a fishery creates dependence, right? So, I mean, if you are engaged in a fishery and you continue to be engaged, you will create some level of dependence. So I think it's very tricky to try to, perhaps think about modifying that language to rely more heavily on one than the other, given that they're so intertwined. But, I appreciate the comments. I don't really have anything else to add. I think they, make a lot of great points and will hopefully generate, a lot of good thought.
Thanks, Michelle. Is there anyone else around the table that would like to offer any comments or thoughts? Brandon did a really nice job outlining the information he currently has with a plan for taking any additional information today and crafting it into a letter for submission. John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at some of the items there for National Standard 4 and tying it into the previous discussion about the RSA, I know that as a lot of us we've had problems filling our positions, and I was talking to Wes and Sonny earlier, and even there, it sounds like there's not a big pool of people coming up. Would it be possible to maybe use a research set aside to maybe have like NGOs that work on social service type things pay for the research set aside and use that quota to incentivize commercial fishermen, let's say, to take on somebody from an underserved community to serve as a mate, teach them how to commercially fish, to expand the pool that way. It might be a way that would, especially if it was just kept to commercial fishing, it wouldn't bring in a lot more enforcement costs because these are fishermen who are already following the rules. And so, that way they'd be incentivized to take on let's say, somebody from an underserved community. Just an idea.
Okay. Thanks for that, John. Is there anyone else? Seeing nobody at the table at this time, we have a few minutes. I'll go out to the audience. Does anyone from the audience have anything they would like to offer? Jeff and Megan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a member of the council, Jeff Kalen with once. So I listened to this up in Maine in June too, and been carrying the documents around, and I found Brandon's comments extremely helpful because we were kind of wondering what the problem is that's attempted to be solved here. So we've started to put comments together, and one thing that seems to be missing my old saw, and that is the potential opportunities for emerging stocks relative to the climate discussion. That's one thing that I'd like the council to consider to add to what Brandon's come up with. Other than that, I think it's great and it's very, very helpful, and we appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate your comment. Come on up, Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lapp-Seafries. I'm going to continue to go through these documents and submit more detailed written comments, but one thing that I did want to mention is that I also was at New England at the Fishery Management Council meeting in June, and we received a presentation on this issue. And there was a question to the agency, very specific, because the agency said, well, we want to have something in place by 2024. And they were very clear about that. And when the question was, well, what are you aiming to have in place? There was no response. And when I, as a stakeholder, read these documents and I see comments like disadvantaged communities or EEJ communities, being discussed as part of the National Standard 8 discussion, fishing communities is defined by the Act. The Act, the legislative act of Congress defines fishing communities. And a policy decision cannot replace the intent of Congress. That's very established, in the legal world. But when I look at this and then it is coupled with the discussion of new entrants, I do have a lot of concerns because, as it was mentioned by Brandon did a good job about this. We've developed fisheries management over decades based on limited access and based on preventing overcapitalization of fisheries. But if the focus is on bringing in new entrants and redefining fishing communities, those two things together give me a lot of concern, especially when there is a clear intent to create an outcome within a year, but we don't know what that outcome is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Megan, for those comments. Seeing no other hands at this time, I'm going to go ahead and bring things back to the council. Are there any final comments for Brandon? Seems as if everyone is pretty happy with what's already been put together and what was presented today. And okay, I'm seeing nods around the table. So Brandon, I think that's the feedback for today. And we'll look forward to seeing the final letter when it's submitted by the council. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, council.
Yeah, and good luck with the move in. I take my daughter in 8 days, 12 hours, and 15 minutes for the drop off. So looking forward to that as much as you are, I'm sure. Okay, what we're going to do, we have a little bit of time, and I'm not going to extend this beyond our time limitations that we had on the agenda for today. That's something I've always tried to maintain as my, my 7 years here as chair. But we are not going to have Dewey at the table tomorrow morning, since today is Dewey's last day, and we had a nice ceremony to recognize Dewey for all his time and energy and efforts yesterday. But on tomorrow's agenda is Dewey Hemmelwright. So I thought maybe Dewey, if you're prepared, we can cover your items. That way you don't have to worry about it. You can sit in the back with a hoodie and sweatpants on and not worry too much about it. So we've got a couple things from you today. The first, do you want to start with the committee report, and then we'll do liaison report? We'll do both.
That'd be fine. Mr.
Okay.
Chairman.
Yeah. Do you want to start with the committee, HMS committee report, and then we'll pick up on liaison report after that?
All right, we had a HMS committee meeting on July the 11th to review Amendment 15, Spatial Management Electronic Monitoring, advanced notice of proposed rulemaking on electronic monitoring and scoping for A16. I'm still trying to digest Amendment 15. It's about a 600-page inch and 7/16 document that is going to have a lot of effect on the pelagic longline industry. And some of the things that are in that we discussed that's in there is about modification, data collected, and assessment of 4 commercial pelagic longline spatial management areas that have been closed for some of them for over 20 years. And data need to be given from this area to look at possible gear changes that's happened over time period and what's the effect of the gear in these areas. The first component of A15 is considered modification of data collecting when analyzing the 4 current spatial management areas that restrict or prohibit commercial fishing. The committee reviewed the NOAA HMS preferred alternative package for the Mid-Atlantic shark bottom fish closure that's currently prohibited with exception of data collection. The package would extend the current closed area and shift timing of the closed area a little different from January 1 to July 31st to November 1 to 31, May 31. The preferred alternative package would require commercial data collection, but would establish a timeline for when the spatial management area would be reevaluated in the future for continuing assessment of these areas. The NOAA preferred alternatives for evaluation timing is every 3 years, were triggered by a list of provisions. Although the committee was supportive of these measures, they had some reservations and believed that the proposed rules will have little to no impact on the fishing given the limited shark fishing occurring in the area. What you have a closed area off the state of North Carolina for 6 months a year. It's been in place for probably about 15 years, and they're looking at extending it a little bit more out to the eastern. But the fact of the matter is, your pelagic longline industry or your bottom longline industry for sharks is pretty much killed. You got a few places that's left fishing for small sharks down in Florida. You got a research fishery that now that they have banned fins is not going fishing because you can't go fishing for just the meat. We had a sustainable fishery in the U.S. and they killed it. What Congress did with the banning of the fins. And so as we move forward and you're out there fishing, the population of sharks are increasing. So be expecting that if you have an opportunity to be in a $1 million tournament and you have a big fish and it gets eaten by a shark, don't blame the fisherman. And so that's going to continue to happen because we have no more shark fishermen basically left. Pelagic longline monitoring cost allocation, they had is where they're going to look at taking. We have presently now 2 cameras on our vessels. Thing that we have to turn our tapes in after every trip. You got vessel monitoring systems, and now what they're looking to do is that cost of that system is to make the fishermen pay for it. industry funding. And also in certain areas that you're fishing, you would have to pay for somebody up to 200. I'm going to have to negotiate a contract with a vendor for up to $289 for one person to look at my videotape. And so some vessels that have had in certain situations, it's very possible that they could have 100 sits that have to be reviewed. And of them 100 sits, if their cameras in their system broke, could be probably about another $12,000. And if their vessel monitoring system broke, it could be $3,100. So when you add that up, it could be close to probably about 50 grand. That's a real possibility at one time could be happening, that somebody would have to do that, would have to pay them cost. And so I don't see, particularly to this amendment, how the pelagic longline industry is going to continue on with having to pay the cost of the camera system, let alone some other things. I'll quit giving my opinion and give my committee report. But it's just, it's devastating of what's going to be coming about. We got into, we also got into the part that has to do with the advance notice of proposed rulemaking for electronic requirements. They're looking at considering several electronic reporting requirements, which I'm generally always in favor of, particularly because it helps speed it up, the process and stuff like that for us. And also for certain recreational fisheries, HMS charter boats, for electronic logbooks, as well as collect information to existing electronic mechanisms for dealer and recreational permit holders, facilitate HMS reporting through incentive and or penalties, and provide electronic reporting for expanded or exempted fishing permit program permit holders. The public comment period for advance notice of proposed rulemaking on electronic reporting closes on August 18th, 2023. The only thing that I have a issue or discussion with, which I'm glad I read the August 18th, I'll be making comments on this, is that I recently went through, I probably have told some of y'all this, last year my vessel monitoring system went out, and for 3 months it went out, and I continued fishing unbeknownst to my vessel monitoring system went out. And so that vessel monitoring system also, 12 hours after we harvest or we haul back, you have to report whether you caught a bluefin tuna or not. So for 3 months, my vessel made 21 sets, and I didn't record to a vessel monitoring system. So when they come out with the IBQ quota in December of last year, I was 21 sets short because I didn't know we were going to use vessel monitoring system. So this past year, January 13th, I filed for a appeal, and it took 7 months for appeal to go through, and I received in July the 23rd of this year a 10-page lawyer and administrative law judge that I won my case, and I get my 21 sits, but I needed them 21 sits in January, February, March when my vessel was tied to the dock. And had I not had a paper logbook, I wouldn't have nothing to argue or to fight the case with. So as they go to this 100% VMS reporting that they're looking to go to in the pelagic longline industry, how we get quota, and I don't think there's anybody else left in this country that has to do this. If we don't go fishing and make sets, we don't get quota for your bluefin quota. Now, if you go mahi fishing and make longline sets, they won't count that. So you have to be actively pelagic longlining. You can't go mahi fishing. You can't go bottom fishing, or else you won't get enough quota to go fishing the following year or to run in 3 years. And so that's why I wonder what's going to happen if we don't have some type of backup system, if you're placing it upon a catch share like this, we got an IBQ quota, and what's going to happen here. So really, it's really important, you know, what they're going to decide on this. And HMS is a different animal, as y'all have heard me always say, but that's another topic. We also heard public comment from industry that spoke in favor of recommending. They also considered requiring the documentation numbers be placed attached to vessel and permit holders to report all gear types on board, the unique identifier for individuals, Coast Guard safety number, for permitted vessels that also have a for-sale endorsement to declare their intent, fishing type prior to leaving the dock, for hire versus commercial trip, do not fish report, permit holders to identify all reports, all permits, GARFO permits in the reporting system. The next one, there's over 6,000 HMS permit holders implementing rigid reporting requirements is essential to the management of a fleet of this magnitude. Also, we discussed about Amendment 16 shark management issues, and hopefully they'll have some common sense to give some flexibility in some of the trip limits where they haven't in the past. Like they'll set a trip limit of 8 sharks, and only about for the last 7 years, only 50% of the quota, or less than 50% will get caught. And they could have easily put in like 25 sharks to 80%, but they just said they didn't have the flexibility to do that. The committee also discussed the Shark Fin Elimination Act and the confusion associated with the proper way to dispose of shark fins after a shark is landed. The committee recommended that HMS provide clear messaging on this issue to avoid any further challenges. Right now, you have to land a shark with its fins naturally attached to the dock, even though you can't have the fins. So you cut the fins off, and then you got to go find somewhere to throw them in a dumpster or do something like that. And what the folks that are left were looking for, if you can't have the fins, why not cut the fins off at sea and put them over with the entrails of the shark when you process it? So it's a real mess, and that will continue. And that, Mr. Chairman, is a little subset of what was printed for me and what I threw in my 2 cents worth, which you knew I would do anyway. And with that, I'm going to pass on the South Atlantic Council report. It's in the briefing book. And so you can, if y'all are really gung-ho to read that, there's a lot of things going on there. And I wish luck to whoever replaces me in the South Atlantic. And be sure to have a comfortable seat when you're sitting there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. We figured you'd just tell us like it is, right? Yeah, I've been a part of, I've listened to and sat through probably 3 or 4 times now the presentation from HMS on all the changes that are being discussed, and it's quite overwhelming. So thanks for your time and energy putting that together. So the message that I'm getting from staff is that their plan would be to take the work of the committee, put together a letter of comment from the council on behalf of the council to HMS regarding the different work that they're planning to do. So Dewey highlighted some of the parts of that discussion, but the staff were planning to put a document together unless there's objection to that in any way by members of the council. I don't see any at this time, but I do have a question or comment from Sonny. Go ahead, Sonny.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that, Dewey. In that report, I don't think I heard you say that, and I know it is, it's $280 a set, correct?
Yeah, it's you got to negotiate. You would have to negotiate with a vendor who I don't know who that is yet, is what they're proposing. And this is all proposed, but you know how that works. So yeah, it's up to $287. I think they have in their thing that you would negotiate with a vendor if you're in a certain area for them to review your videotape for that set. And so this amendment here, of all my years of dealing with HMS, I don't have it all in my head how it works, but I'll be following up this week with them a little more to get an understanding of this document of what it takes, and this new spatial management of predicting, like taking salinity, a few different things, and taking past observer work and predicting where the hot spots are going to be in the ocean. I'm not one that, I probably can't predict what I was going to do yesterday or today. But they're going to be able to. So I just see it as a lot of, we're going to have the pelagic longline industry in our highest about 10 years ago, we're sitting about 11 million hooks. I think last year we're down around 3 million hooks. At that particular time, I added up the other day because we were going to talk about squid here. At our high or 11 million hooks, we used about, I think it was 50 million squid. And that's a 100-gram squid at 4.5 grams to a pound. And now we're down to using 18 million squid, individual squids, just to figure it up, even though we're a small portion, probably 2,000 metric tons of squid, but we're just going to be, they're going to regulate us right out of it. You can't financially go do it. And what they're placing upon us, there's nobody else in the industry along here that's what's placed upon us, but yet they'll give our marketplace to every other country to ship in here. But yet they want to place the burden of HMS fisheries on the pelagic longline industry. And it's just like, I don't know if it's ever going to stop. It probably won't be in my time. So good luck.
Another question, please. I know I asked this question before, but what kind of cameras does China and Japan have on their longline vessels?
The only, they don't have no cameras and they're not made to, but yet we'll give them our marketplace.
Thank you. And so one more question and then I'll leave it at that. So they want you to pay for the cameras and the herring vessels are wanting to pay for their observers. So I think my next question would be, is this the intent of the service to start small and then grow it into that all the industry pays for the observers? Is that, I don't know.
Well, the herring industry funded monitoring program is an action of the New England Fishery Management Council, as is the groundfish program as well.
I'm just trying to think, is this a start with them, with the HMS will sooner or later the industry will be asked to have to pay for observers? I believe, is that my question?
It could be a possible template. I don't know that. You know how templates work.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're placed or not. So I guess we'll just have to stay tuned.
That's my thought anyway. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. It sounds like a really good dinner topic that Sonny, you and Mike can find a quiet corner of a room of a restaurant somewhere and have that discussion. Okay, that concludes our business. Tim, I wanted to ask you, you're going to plan to be here tomorrow? Okay. I think when we get into our other reports, I'll ask that if you're willing to do a condensed version of the briefing report from the South Atlantic.
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. All right, well, that concludes our business. It's a little after 4:30. I think we're going to just call it a day. And Chris has something he would like to announce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two things. I sent out a flurry of emails this afternoon. One of them related to the election of officers tomorrow morning. So take a look at that. If there's any questions, certainly send me an email or ask me about that. And we have hospitality tonight. It's in room 630. Everyone's invited, so I'll see you there. Thank you.
Yeah, and so my wife is planning to come over to hospitality tonight. So just remember, what happens at the council stays at the council. Okay, no stories.